Hello, fellow sapiens, and welcome to Sleepless Homo. Whether you've settled into bed, driving through the night, or quietly working with headphones on, this is your moment to slow down, to step out of the noise, and drift into the deep, slow rhythms of prehistory. This is long-form storytelling for tired minds, calm, curious, and just the right amount of nerdy. And if this kind of content helps whether to fall asleep, to focus, or simply to fill your brain with something better than doom scrolling, consider giving this a like and subscribing. It's the simplest way to help more curious humans discover this space, a quiet little corner of the internet where knowledge still wins. And tell me, what do you use this for? Are you listening before sleep, while driving, cooking, or sneaking some history into your workday? Or maybe, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Either way, thank you for being here. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Now, let's begin. To a skull that spent 90 years hidden in a well, and to the DNA that just changed the story of 150,000 years ago. Somewhere in the summer of 1933, in the northeastern provinces of China, beneath the tightening grip of Japanese occupation, a nameless worker stood knee-deep in the river mud. He was laboring on the foundations of a bridge that would stretch across the Songhua River near the city of Harbin, in a province called Heilongjiang, the Black Dragon River, a place where rivers carve through the cold flatlands and where winters have teeth sharp enough to crack bone. And there in the muck, among the stones and the chaos of construction, he saw something that did not belong, something shaped like a human head, only it was far, far larger than any human head had any right to be. Now, to be clear, we will probably never know his name. This man, whose quiet decision would preserve one of the most important human fossils ever found, remains anonymous. There is no diary, no eyewitness report. His story comes only from the memory of his family, whispered decades later, that he recognized the skull as unusual, important even, but feared the consequences of handing it over to the Japanese authorities who then controlled the region. And so, quietly, without fanfare, he took the skull home, and he hid it. Not in a museum, not in a drawer, but in a well, a literal well. Lowered into the cold darkness, sealed away, forgotten. And there it stayed. Through the collapse of Imperial Japan, through the bloodshed of the Second World War, through the Chinese Civil War, through the rise of the People's Republic, through the Cultural Revolution, through the decades of silence that followed, the skull sat, submerged in the damp cold at the bottom of a rural well, silent, preserved, waiting. It is one of the most absurd accidents in the history of paleoanthropology, and yet, perhaps, it is not entirely unique, because this is not the first time that fossils from this era in China have nearly vanished from the human record. Let me take you briefly to the 1930s again, to another discovery. A collection of fossils that would become known as the Peking Man. Excavated from Zhoukoudian, a cave site near Beijing, these fossils represented one of the first major finds of Homo erectus, our ancient upright walking ancestors who lived more than 500,000 years ago. Teeth, skull fragments, pieces of jaw. Together they painted a picture of an ancient hominin, long before modern humans. But then came the Second World War. As Japanese forces advanced, the fossils were packed up, placed into wooden crates, and entrusted to the United States Marines stationed in China. Their mission was to transport the fossils to safety, by ship, to the American Museum of Natural History in New York. But somewhere between the gates of the Peking Union Medical College and the docks in Qinhuangdao, the fossils vanished. Crates lost, possibly stolen, possibly destroyed, possibly sunk to the bottom of the ocean. To this day, the original fossils of Peking Man have never been found. Only casts, photographs, and written descriptions remain. It is one of the greatest losses in the history of archaeology, and for a long time it was assumed that the same fate had quietly fallen upon the Harbin skull. Only, this one came back. Sometime in the final years of the 2010s, the worker, now an old man, knew that he did not have long left. Perhaps weighed by the gravity of what he had hidden, or simply wanting to pass it on before the end, he told his family about the well, about the skull inside it. And in 2018, after 90 years in the dark, the skull was recovered and donated to the Hebei Geo University. Scientists, when first confronted with it, were stunned. This was not a broken jaw or a partial bone. This was a complete cranium, heavy, massive. The brow ridges were enormous, the eye sockets were wide and square, the face was tucked flat beneath a towering brain case, and the brain case itself was massive, more than 1,500 cubic centimeters, putting it not only within the range of modern humans but actually exceeding most. A head bigger than ours. But what was it? It did not match Homo sapiens. The face was too robust, the brow too thick, but it also did not match Neanderthals, lacking their characteristic mid-face projection and their swept-back skull shape. Nor did it fully match Homo erectus, the earlier species known from East Asia. It was something else, something that sat awkwardly, somewhere between. For those of you picturing scientists in white lab coats immediately solving this mystery, let me gently disabuse you of that fantasy. Paleoanthropology is rarely a clean science. Bones rarely come with labels. And this skull, well, this skull was a problem. The first challenge was this. It had no stratigraphic context, no dirt stuck to it, no clear layer of sediment from which it had been pulled. Dating something in isolation, without the context of the surrounding rocks or fauna, is notoriously difficult. Scientists turned to uranium series dating, a method that measures the radioactive decay within the fossil itself. The results gave a minimum age of 146,000 years, possibly older. This placed the Harbin skull in the Middle Pleistocene, a period spanning from roughly 789,000 to 130,000 years ago. A turbulent era, an era of ice ages, an era when multiple human species shared the planet, and sometimes shared genes. But even with an age in hand, the question remained, what exactly was it? In 2021, a team of Chinese paleoanthropologists, led by Shijun Ni and Qiang Ji, proposed something bold, that this was not simply another Denisovan, not a Neanderthal, not a strange Homo erectus, but something distinct, a new species. They named it Homo longi, the Dragon Man, after the Black Dragon River where it was found. It was a provocative claim. Some agreed, others, not so much. Paleoanthropology is filled with debates over species definitions. Where does one species end and another begin? Is it about morphology, how bones look? Is it about genetics, how closely DNA aligns? Or is it, uncomfortably, about the lines drawn by humans who study humans, prone to all the biases that humans have? The Harbin skull arrived into this debate like a meteor, beautiful, frustrating, and deeply mysterious. But perhaps the most poetic irony of all is this. The very act of hiding this skull, lowering it into a cold well for nearly a century, may be the only reason we still have its DNA. Had it been handed over in 1933, it likely would have been treated with the preservation chemicals of the time, which destroy genetic material. Or perhaps it would have been boxed and sent down the same doomed path as the Peking Man fossils, vanished forever into the chaos of war. Instead, it survived. For 90 years, it waited. And when it finally came back into the light, it changed the story of what it means to be human in 150,000 years ago. Or at least, what little of that story we think we know so far. Because this is the humble truth of paleoanthropology. Every fossil is an answer, but every fossil is also a question. And sometimes, the question is even bigger than the answer. When the Harbin skull was finally hauled from the well in 2018 and placed into scientific hands, it did not take long for the realization to set in. This was not just any fossil. This was not another fragment of a jawbone or an isolated molar. It was a complete cranium, heavy, towering, nearly intact. And standing face to face with it, researchers were met with a puzzle that did not want to solve itself. At first glance, the Harbin cranium feels almost contradictory. The overall shape is unmistakably human, not in the cartoon sense of what we imagine ancient humans to look like, sloping brows, jutting jaws, club in hand, but recognizably human in the fundamental architecture of the face. And yet everything is exaggerated. The brow ridge is enormous, so prominent it forms a kind of ledge above the eyes, casting deep shadows where the eyes would have once gazed out. The orbits themselves, the eye sockets, are square, massive, open like the windows of a fortress. Below them, the cheekbones sweep back low and wide, unlike the forward-projecting midface of Neanderthals. The face, overall, is flat, tucked tightly under the brain case rather than jutting outward like in so many of our cousins. And then, there is the brain. The brain case of the Harbin skull is, by any hominin standard, extraordinary. A volume exceeding 1,500 cubic centimeters. To put that into context, the average modern human brain clocks in around 1,300 to 1,400 cubic centimeters. Neanderthals, often considered the brainiest in pure volume, usually ranged between 1,400 and 1,600. But the Harbin skull is comfortably within the upper end of modern humans and Neanderthals possibly exceeding it. This was a big head, no polite way to say it. And the sheer thickness of the bone. The walls of the cranium are robust, heavy, almost armor-like, not fragile like modern human skulls, a head built for survival in a harsher world, or perhaps for a harsher kind of life. But for all its bulk, it did not belong neatly to any known category, not Homo sapiens. The face is too robust, the brow too extreme, the overall morphology simply wrong for our species. Not Neanderthal. Missing the characteristic mid-face bulge, lacking the backward sweeping occipital bun, and without the toroidont molars that so often define Neanderthal dentition. Not Homo erectus either. Too brainy, too derived, lacking the low receding forehead and massive posterbital constriction of erectus. And yet, not entirely alien to any of them. In 2021, after 2 years of careful analysis, a research team led by Shijun Ni and Chang Ji published a suite of papers that would send a quiet shockwave through the world of human origins. They proposed that the Harbin skull did not belong to Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalensis, or Homo erectus, but to something distinct, a sister lineage, a previously unnamed species. And they called it Homo longi, the dragon man, named not for fantasy, but for the Black Dragon River, Heilongjiang, where it had been discovered all those years ago. Now, it is worth pausing here to be clear about something. Paleoanthropologists do not name new species lightly. There is an inherent humility that hangs over this field, or at least there should be, because to name a species is to draw a line through deep time, to say, here, this is different. Different enough that it does not belong in any other group we know. But evolution does not always reward our need for neat labels. It is not a staircase. It is not a ladder. It is not even a tree half the time. It is more like a braided stream, branches splitting, converging, diverging again, with populations mixing, splitting, and remixing in ways that do not always leave clear boundaries. So what made them so confident, or at least confident enough to propose Homo longi? It came down to a detailed morphological comparison. The team analyzed 95 different fossil crania, jaws, and teeth from hominin species across Africa, Europe, and Asia. They measured over 600 distinct anatomical features. They used a supercomputer to generate billions of potential evolutionary family trees, each one testing how the Harbin skull might fit with what we already knew. And the result that kept emerging over and over was this. The Harbin skull belonged to a lineage that was more closely related to Homo sapiens than Neanderthals were. This was not expected. Because for over a decade, the model looked something like this. Homo heidelbergensis, a species thought to be the common ancestor of both Neanderthals and Denisovans, splits into Neanderthals moving west into Europe and Denisovans moving east into Asia. From a separate branch, Homo sapiens emerges in Africa. Neanderthals and Denisovans are sister groups, more closely related to each other than either is to us. But the Harbin data disrupted that. It suggested that the Harbin lineage, Dragon Man, split from the branch leading to Homo sapiens after the split from Neanderthals. Meaning, Dragon Man was, in some ways, our closer cousin than the Neanderthals were, a provocative claim, and one that, to be clear, not all researchers accepted. One of the complications here is that the Harbin skull shares features with other mysterious fossils in East Asia. The Dali cranium, found in Shanxi province in the 1970s, the Jinyushan fossil, the Xiahe mandible from the Tibetan plateau, and others. For decades, these fossils floated in taxonomic limbo. Were they archaic Homo sapiens? Were they Denisovans? Were they regional variants of Homo erectus? No one agreed. The naming of Homo longi was an attempt to finally bring clarity to that cloud. To say, these fossils, Harbin, Dali, Jinyushan, belong together. A lineage of big-brained, cold-adapted humans who thrived in East Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, separate from Neanderthals, separate from us, but perhaps not entirely separate, because in human evolution, separation is always relative. And yet, there was a growing suspicion, a shadow hanging over the taxonomy, a genetic ghost that had been haunting the field since 2010. A ghost first discovered not in a skull, not in a femur, not in a jaw, but in a pinky bone pulled from the cold floor of Denisova Cave in Siberia, a bone whose DNA revealed an entire unknown human population, the Denisovans, a lineage genetically distinct from both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, but whose physical appearance remained entirely unknown. No skull, no face, only a genome. And as more scientists stared at the Harbin skull, as they traced the lines of its brow, measured the sweep of its cheekbones, and weighed its enormous brain case, a question began to whisper. Is this the face of the Denisovans? Could it be that the Harbin skull, this giant, heavy, strange cranium that broke all our neat little categories, was not some separate species at all, but simply the first time we were meeting the Denisovans face to face? At the time, in 2021, there was no DNA to answer the question. Efforts to extract genetic material from the Harbin skull had failed. The bone was too degraded, too contaminated. The petrous bone, that dense part of the inner ear that so often preserves DNA, yielded nothing. Teeth, the usual fallback, also came up blank. The mystery would remain, for now. But even without DNA, the skull itself told a story of a lineage built for life in the cold grasslands and river valleys of northern China. A lineage with massive brains, thick bones, and faces that blended the archaic with the modern. A lineage that did not fit into the boxes we had drawn. A skull unlike any other, but a skull that still had one more secret to reveal. And it was hiding, not in the bone, not in the marrow, but in the dirtiest, most overlooked corner of the human mouth. And that is where we will go next. There is a strange kind of irony in paleoanthropology, a field obsessed with the oldest things, yet constantly haunted by the most frustrating question. How old is it? Really? Because a fossil without a date is like a sentence ripped from a book whose title you do not know. Meaningless, until placed in time. Without time, you cannot know what came before, what came after, or what it even means. You cannot know if something is an ancestor or a cousin, a pioneer or a remnant, a dead end, or the seed of something still alive. Time is everything. And this was the problem that immediately confronted researchers when the Harbin skull emerged from that well in 2018. For all its mass, its beauty, and its haunting anatomy, it came with no instructions, no sediment stuck to its bones, no layer of rock to tie it to, no buried tools, no animal bones alongside it, no archaeological context at all. It had spent 90 years in a well, a void, disconnected from the geological record that usually holds the keys to dating the past. And this creates a very particular kind of nightmare for scientists, because when you do not know where a fossil comes from, you cannot use the most reliable dating methods. You cannot date the surrounding sediment because there is no sediment. You cannot cross-check with volcanic ash layers because there is no ash. You cannot compare it to other fossils from the same deposit because there is no deposit. You are left with the fossil itself. And the brutal question becomes, is there anything left in the fossil that remembers how long it has been dead? In this case, the answer was yes. Barely, but yes. The method that unlocked the Harbin skull's age is something called uranium series dating. A marvel of modern geochemistry, but one with a story that starts, not in anthropology, but in nuclear physics. Deep inside bones and teeth, trace amounts of uranium are absorbed from groundwater over time. As uranium decays, it transforms into a series of daughter isotopes, including thorium and protactinium, each with its own decay rate, its own atomic clock. By measuring the ratio between uranium and its daughter isotopes, scientists can calculate how long the decay process has been underway. In other words, how long it has been since the bone stopped being alive. This is not a perfect method. Bones are porous, water moves, minerals leach in and out. It is a messy clock. But when other methods fail, when radiocarbon dating cannot reach far enough back, when luminescence dating has no sediment to work with, uranium series is often the last, best tool left. And in the case of the Harbin skull, it worked, barely. The results pointed to a minimum age of 146,000 years, possibly much older. Some estimates even push it toward 296,000 years, but with wider error margins. What is important is that this anchors the skull squarely within the Middle Pleistocene, an era of deep evolutionary turbulence stretching from roughly 789,000 to 130,000 years ago. The Middle Pleistocene, a time when the world did not belong to us, not yet. In fact, it belonged to no one species. This was a planet shared, a planet crowded with hominins. Imagine it. Somewhere between 3 and perhaps as many as 5 different kinds of humans walked the earth at once. Homo erectus, still hanging on in parts of Asia. Neanderthals, already evolving in Europe and the Near East. Denisovans, ghostly and poorly understood, drifting across Asia. Possibly Homo heidelbergensis, still clinging to parts of Africa and Europe. And then, Homo sapiens, still young, still rare, not yet dominant. It is a reminder, uncomfortable perhaps, that being the only human species is a very recent, very strange condition. For most of our evolutionary history, we were never alone. We were one of many, a branch among branches, a voice among a chorus. And this skull, this heavy, thick-boned skull from Harbin, belonged to that world. A world where humans were plural, where survival was not guaranteed, where climates swung violently between glacial cold and brief interglacial warmth, where rivers froze, ice sheets advanced, and mammoths roamed the grasslands of northern China. But here is where things get even more interesting. The Harbin skull does not just belong anywhere within the Middle Pleistocene. Its age puts it at a very particular crossroads. A moment when the Denisovan lineage was diverging from the others. A moment when Neanderthals were emerging in the West. A moment when modern Homo sapiens, our lineage, was not yet fully formed, but beginning to crystallize out of the genetic haze of earlier ancestors in Africa. This is the backdrop. This is the crucible from which Dragon Man comes. And yet, the dating alone does not solve the mystery of what he is. Because dating a fossil tells you when an individual died. It does not, on its own, tell you who they were, or what population they belong to, or how that population connects to others. It simply places a pin on the timeline and says, here, this person lived, then. And then it hands the problem right back to morphology, right back to genetics, right back to the maddening, beautiful mess of evolutionary trees that do not always want to cooperate with our categories. Still, the date matters, immensely. It tells us that the Harbin skull was not some late surviving relic, not some strange offshoot clinging to the margins while modern humans rose. No, this was a contemporary of the Denisovans of Siberia, a contemporary of the ancestors of Neanderthals, a contemporary of the early populations that would eventually become us. It also means that the Harbin lineage was thriving in northern China during one of the most brutally cold phases of the Ice Age. This raises questions not only about anatomy, the thickness of the bones, the enormous nasal cavity likely adapted for cold, the wide face designed to support massive chewing muscles, but also about behavior, clothing, shelter, fire, social cooperation, the invisible technologies that leave few traces in the archaeological record, but are the difference between life and death in climates where winter can kill. And it invites a deeper question still. If this skull survived, how many others did not? How much of the story of this population is already lost to erosion, to rivers, to time, to the simple physics of decay? For every skull pulled from a well, how many were crushed by glaciers, dissolved by acid soils, buried under cities, roads, and railways? It is a question that haunts all of paleoanthropology. The fossil record is not a complete archive, it is a salvage operation. A whisper from deep time, a handful of surviving pages from a library that mostly burned down. But this page, this skull, survived. And thanks to uranium ticking away in the calcium matrix of its bone, we can say, with reasonable confidence, that it comes from a window of time stretching between 146,000 and perhaps as far back as 296,000 years ago. A window when the world was not yet ours, when the story of humanity was still being written by more hands than just our own. But even with a date in hand, one question still loomed over the Dragon Man. Who was he really? A new species? A ghost from a known lineage? Or the first face of a group we had only ever known by their DNA, and never by their bones? The answer was not in the skull. It was hiding in something far smaller, far dirtier, and far more surprising. A crust, a film, a hardened lump of ancient spit, bacteria, and plaque. And that is where the real surprise began. So, who was he? This man who lived nearly 150,000 years ago in what is now northeastern China. The man whose skull would sleep for almost a century at the bottom of a well. The man whose DNA would change the way we talk about Denisovans forever. It is one thing to date a fossil, it is another to name it. But the real question, the one that keeps both scientists and insomniac sapiens awake at night, is this: what was it like to be him? We are not just talking about lineage charts or molecular markers anymore. We are talking about flesh, muscle, movement, breath, a day in his life, a body moving through the cold river valleys of Heilongjiang, hunting, sleeping, laughing maybe, suffering certainly. The human part of the human story. Let us start with the basics. Size. By every anatomical marker we have, the Harbin individual was large, not just slightly bigger than us, significantly so. The brain case alone, as we explored earlier, exceeded 1,500 cubic centimeters, a volume putting him at the upper end of Neanderthals and beyond the average for modern Homo sapiens. And this matters, because brain size scales with body size. Bigger heads usually mean bigger bodies to carry them. Facial reconstruction experts working with digital scans and 3D modeling have suggested that the Harbin man would have stood close to 1.8 meters tall, or nearly 6 feet, with a body mass around 100 kilograms. That is about 220 pounds. A frame that by modern human standards would have been broad-shouldered, heavily muscled, and dense-boned. Think powerlifter, not marathon runner. The skull confirms this. The bone walls themselves are thick, up to 2 times thicker in some places than the average human skull today. The nasal cavity is enormous, likely an adaptation for cold air intake, warming each breath before it reached the lungs. The face is wide and flat, with sweeping zygomatic arches giving space for massive chewing muscles. His diet almost certainly included tough, fibrous foods, roots, tubers, sinewy meat, things that require grinding power and heavy jaw function. The brow ridges would have been impossible to ignore, not like ours. Not gentle slopes above the eyes, but deep, shelf-like overhangs, casting the eyes below into shade. If you had stood face to face with him, the psychological effect would have been immediate. A presence that demanded attention, strength carved into bone. And yet, for all the bulk and power suggested by the skeleton, there is something else here, something quieter. The delicate sweep of the cheekbones, the relatively flat midface, the tucked-in profile of the lower face beneath the forehead. These are not features of a brute, they hint at complexity. Evolution rarely builds for single functions. What keeps you warm in winter might also make you look formidable. What strengthens your bite might also shape your voice. We do not have his postcranial skeleton. No femur, no pelvis, no hand bones. Everything we infer about his body comes from that one skull. But comparisons with other Denisovan candidate fossils, like the Xiahe mandible from the Tibetan Plateau or the robust teeth from Denisova Cave in Siberia, suggest that this was not an outlier. Denisovans as a whole were likely big-bodied, cold-adapted, and physically powerful hominins. Giants, by Ice Age standards. But size is not everything. The brain capacity begs its own questions. A volume like this puts the Harbin man in league with modern humans in terms of raw brain size. But brain size alone does not equal cognitive ability. Shape matters. Neural organization matters. But still, this was no simple being. The Middle Pleistocene was not a forgiving time. Survival required planning, cooperation, tool use, social memory, and the ability to adapt to rapidly changing climates. Could he speak? That is harder to answer. We have no larynx, no hyoid bone, no preserved soft tissue, but the cranial base angle and the size of the nasal cavity suggest a respiratory system capable of producing a range of vocalizations. Add to that the growing genetic evidence that Denisovans shared critical DNA regions associated with speech and language development in modern humans and Neanderthals, and it becomes increasingly likely that he could communicate with spoken language. Probably not English or Mandarin, but language in some form. And what about his day-to-day life? Picture the landscape. Northern China, 150,000 years ago. Open grasslands sweeping across river valleys. Forests clinging to the slopes of low hills. Winters bitter and long. Summers brief but green. Mammoths, woolly rhinos, steppe horses, deer, predators like ancient wolves and large cats stalking the edges of human settlements. What would he have eaten? Likely a diet high in protein and fat during the cold seasons. Meat from large game, possibly supplemented with roots, tubers, and seasonal plant foods. The robust molars and massive chewing surfaces suggest a diet requiring considerable mastication. Food was not soft. Teeth were tools. What did he wear? Here the fossil record is almost silent. Organic materials like hide, fiber, and wood rarely survive this long. But no one survives Ice Age winters without insulation. Even Neanderthals, with similarly cold-adapted bodies, likely wore tailored hides. It is reasonable to assume that the Harbin man did too. Simple clothing, perhaps. Furs, animal skins, nothing that would win design awards, but enough to keep out the frostbite. And what about shelter? Caves, if available. Rock overhangs. Possibly structures built from wood and bone. Again, no direct archaeological site can be linked to him specifically, but Denisovan-related sites like Denisova Cave and Xiahe Mandible surroundings suggest a level of behavioral sophistication that included tool use, shelter construction, and possibly even symbolic behavior. Did he make fire? Almost certainly. Fire was not a luxury in this environment. It was a requirement for warmth, for cooking, for protection from predators. Evidence from other Middle Pleistocene sites across China shows consistent fire use by hominins of this era. Did he live alone? Highly unlikely. Sociality is baked into the primate brain. A single individual does not survive long in this landscape. He was probably part of a small group, maybe 20 to 30 individuals, moving seasonally, following game, gathering plants, watching the sky for changing weather. And what about memory, culture, stories told beside the fire, songs hummed before sleep? Here, science can only gesture. The brain was big enough, the social structure complex enough, the survival challenges demanding enough. All the ingredients were there for symbolic thought, for shared narratives, for cultural memory passed from one generation to the next. But we do not know. Not yet. And perhaps that is the most humbling part of all this. For all our technology, for all our dating methods and DNA extractions and CT scans and 3D reconstructions, we still cannot say with certainty what he thought when he woke in the cold mornings of northern China. We cannot know what made him laugh, or if he feared the dark, or how he mourned his dead. What we do know is this. At some point, likely in his middle years, this man died. Whether from injury, illness, old age, or the 1,000 quiet ways people die when life expectancy is short and medical care non-existent, we do not know. And then, somehow, against all odds, his skull survived. Unburied, unburned, unshattered. Hidden first by accident, then by choice, then by time. Until one day, one nearly forgotten day in the early 21st century, it came back into the light. And for the first time, we had a face. Not a guess, not a genetic reconstruction, a real skull, a real human. The Harbin man, the first Denisovan we could look in the eye. But as with everything in paleoanthropology, Answering one question only leads to another. Because identifying a face is not the same as understanding a lineage. And that is where the DNA finally enters the story. There are ghost stories in science, not the kind with rattling chains and cold winds, but the kind where something unseen leaves fingerprints all over the present, where the past lingers in blood, in bone, in the tiny coded spirals of DNA. And perhaps no ghost in the history of paleoanthropology has haunted us quite like the Denisovans. Because for over a decade, Denisovans were a species without a skeleton, a name without a face, a people known not from skulls or skeletons, but from molecules, from fragments so small, so unlikely to survive, that their discovery feels almost absurd. A shard of finger bone, a tooth, a sliver of jaw pulled from high on the Tibetan plateau, pieces, whispers, not enough to build a skeleton, not even close. And yet, from those whispers, we learned that the Denisovans were real as Neanderthals, as real as us. The story starts in the cold, Siberia, the Altai Mountains, a place where the winters are long enough and brutal enough to do something astonishing, preserve DNA for tens of thousands of years. Here, in a cave called Denisova, a team of Russian archaeologists had been excavating for decades. The cave was already famous in scientific circles. Neanderthal artifacts, stone tools, layers of sediment stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. But in the early 2000s, they found something small. A fragment, a pinky bone no bigger than a child's eraser. At first it was barely noticed, another unidentified bone among hundreds, no clear morphology, nothing distinctive. But the fragment was passed to the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, where the world's leading ancient DNA team was beginning to do things that 10 years earlier would have sounded like science fiction. When they sequenced the DNA from the bone, the results shocked everyone. It was not Neanderthal, and it was not Homo sapiens. It was something else, a third lineage, a sister group to Neanderthals, but distinct, separate. It was the first time in history that an entirely new branch of the human family tree was discovered, not from what a fossil looked like, but from what its genes said it was. And so, in 2010, the Denisovans were named, after the cave, after the mountain, after the ghost that left no face. For years after that, they remained shadows. A tooth, another finger bone, a partial jaw found in the highlands of Tibet. But no full skeleton, no skull, no face. And yet, as geneticists began comparing ancient Denisovan DNA to the genomes of modern humans, the story took a stranger turn. Because it turned out, the Denisovans had not disappeared completely. Their DNA was alive, inside us. Not all of us, not equally, but for people today whose ancestry includes Oceania, Papua New Guinea, indigenous Australians, parts of Southeast Asia, the Denisovan signal was loud, 4%, 5%, in some isolated populations, even more. For East Asians, Native Americans, and some Europeans, the signal is fainter, less than 1%. But it is there, a molecular inheritance from encounters tens of thousands of years ago. When Homo sapiens expanded out of Africa, they did not move into empty lands. They met others, Neanderthals in the west, Denisovans in the east, and where they met, they mingled. Not always peacefully, not always permanently, but enough for the genes to cross, for fragments of Denisovan DNA to become part of the story of Homo sapiens. This was a revelation, because it meant the Denisovans were not some fringe population, tucked away in a single valley. They were widespread, from the icy caves of Siberia to the humid forests of island Southeast Asia, from the high plateaus of Tibet to the shores of Australia. They were everywhere we were, or perhaps, we were everywhere they were. The timeline stretches back deep. The oldest known Denisovan lineages diverged from Neanderthals perhaps 500,000 years ago, both descending from a common ancestor that had left Africa much earlier, possibly Homo heidelbergensis. The Denisovans then evolved in Asia, while Neanderthals spread westward into Europe and the Near East. For hundreds of thousands of years, the Denisovans thrived. They adapted to extreme altitudes, Evidence from the Xiahe mandible in Tibet shows that Denisovans had genetic adaptations to hypoxia, low oxygen environments, that some modern Tibetan populations still carry today. Genes that help blood carry more oxygen, genes that survive because of them. There are other traces, genes that affect the immune system, skin, fat metabolism, perhaps even aspects of brain development, though the details are still debated. The Denisovan legacy is not just a historical curiosity, it is inside us, shaping how some humans adapt to the world even now. And yet, for all this, the Denisovans remained invisible. No skull, no body, no face. For over a decade after their discovery, the most sophisticated reconstructions we had of Denisovan appearance were guesses, based on what their sister species, Neanderthals, looked like, based on what we could infer from tiny bones. Wide faces, perhaps. Large teeth, certainly. But no certainty. Not until Harbin. The Harbin skull was the first Denisovan cranium. The first time we could look at the bones of someone whose DNA matched the ghost genome from Denisova Cave. A face that confirmed, yes, this lineage was real, flesh and blood, breath and memory. It is a strange inversion of how paleoanthropology usually works. For most fossils, the bone comes first. Then, if you are lucky, you find the DNA. But Denisovans were the opposite. For over 15 years, they were a genome in search of a skeleton. And this flips the question from history to mystery. How can a species exist without a skeleton? How can something be real before it has a face? It is a question that reminds us how young our science really is. 100 years ago, this would have been impossible. 50 years ago, unimaginable. The idea that you could reconstruct an entire extinct population from the molecules inside a tooth would have sounded like fantasy. And yet, here we are. A species discovered from DNA, verified by DNA. A species that lived from perhaps as early as 300,000 years ago to as recently as 50,000 years ago, coexisting with Homo sapiens, with Neanderthals, with other stranger cousins whose stories we are still piecing together. But perhaps the most humbling part of the Denisovan story is this. We still do not know how many Denisovan populations there were. The genetic evidence suggests at least 3 major branches, possibly more, scattered across Asia. Some adapted to high altitudes, others to the deep tropics. Some remained genetically close to Neanderthals, others diverged dramatically. The diversity within Denisovans may have been as great as the diversity between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. They were not a single tribe, not a single face, but a web of populations spread across continents. And yet, they are gone. The last Denisovans disappeared around 50,000 years ago, maybe a little later in some regions, swallowed by the tides of migration, climate change, and competition, but not entirely gone, not completely. Because when Homo sapiens met Denisovans, we did what humans always do. We fought, we traded, we learned, we stole, we shared, and sometimes we loved. And the genes still tell that story. In the altitude-ready blood of Tibetan shepherds, in the immune systems of Melanesian islanders, in the whispers of molecules that carried something forward, from them to us. There is a strange thing that happens when you try to map the Denisovans. You start with a pinky bone in a cave in Siberia, and by the time you are done, you are looking at half a continent. A footprint stretched from the Arctic edge to the tropical seas, from the snow-choked peaks of Tibet to the equatorial rainforests of Indonesia. And it forces us to ask, were the Denisovans an isolated mountain tribe, or were they something else entirely? A major branch of the human story we simply forgot. For years after their discovery, the mental image most scientists had of Denisovans was small, local, a mountain people, hidden away in the Altai ranges of Siberia, a sister lineage to Neanderthals, who themselves were a famously cold-adapted species. The story seems simple enough. Denisovans were the eastern cousins, tough, resilient, probably fewer in number. but content to survive in remote pockets while modern humans spread and Neanderthals dominated the West. But then came the DNA. And as the genomes of modern humans across the planet were sequenced, the borders of that mental map began to crack. Because the Denisovan signal did not stay in the Altai, it appeared in the genes of people living in Papua New Guinea, in Australia, in the Philippines, in the islands of Melanesia, thousands of kilometers away from that cold Siberian cave, and not just as a trace. In some populations, as much as 5% of their genome was Denisovan. This was not a local mountain tribe. This was something bigger. The map started to redraw itself. It is now clear that Denisovans were not confined to a single region. Their genetic legacy traces a massive arc across Asia, from western Siberia in the north, to the Tibetan Plateau in the west, to the coasts of southern China, and outwards into the island chains of Southeast Asia and Oceania. But here's the strange part. The deeper scientists look into the genetics, the more it becomes clear there was not one Denisovan population. There were many. The DNA from the finger bone in Denisova Cave, a specimen often referred to as Denisova 3, is different from the DNA recovered from the Shahe jawbone on the Tibetan Plateau, different again from the Denisovan signal found in modern Papuan populations. We are not looking at one tribe migrating outward. We are looking at a web of Denisovan populations, branches that split, merged, split again, a network of human groups scattered across vast landscapes. And it raises a difficult question. Were the Denisovans the dominant humans of Asia for hundreds of thousands of years? The archaeological record is frustratingly thin. Fossils are scarce. Organic materials from Denisovan sites are almost non-existent. But the genetic record does not lie. Wherever Homo sapiens went in Asia, we met Denisovans. And not just once. There were multiple waves of contact, different Denisovan groups mixing with different waves of Homo sapiens at different times. Some Denisovan populations were adapted to the freezing cold of Siberia. Others were mountain people, high-altitude specialists. The Shahe mandible, found at over 3,000 meters elevation, carries genetic adaptations to hypoxia, the same adaptations found in modern Tibetans, genes that let blood carry more oxygen in thin air. It is one of the clearest cases in the world where an ancient interbreeding event shaped the physiology of modern people. And yet others were sea crossers. The Denisovan DNA found in modern island populations suggests that some groups made it as far as the Wallace Line, that invisible biogeographical barrier between mainland Asia and the deep islands of Oceania. Whether they sailed or walked across Ice Age land bridges, the fact remains. Denisovans reached places once thought impossible. But where are the bones? This remains one of the great frustrations of archaeology. The genetic map says they were everywhere, but the fossil map is almost empty. Besides the handful of remains from Denisova Cave, the Shahe mandible from Tibet, and the Harbin skull in northeastern China, there is almost nothing concrete. No limb bones from Southeast Asia. No settlements confirmed as Denisovan, just ghost traces in our DNA. Some researchers suspect the answer is taphonomy, the cruel randomness of what survives in the fossil record. The highland caves of Siberia preserve bones because they are cold. The wet tropics of Indonesia do not. Bone dissolves, time erases. Perhaps the Denisovans lived there for tens of thousands of years, and the earth simply swallowed the evidence. Or perhaps we have already found Denisovan bones, and just misclassified them. There are a number of strange fossils from East Asia that do not fit cleanly into the Homo sapiens or Neanderthal categories. The Dali cranium from northern China, the Jinyushan skeleton, the Penghu jaw dredged from the ocean floor off Taiwan. Some of these specimens are robust, big-brained, heavy-browed, Denisovan-like, but without DNA it is impossible to say for sure. And the Harbin skull, the so-called Dragon Man, now sits at the center of this debate. Is it Denisovan? The genetic data from proteins and mitochondrial DNA says yes, or rather, it says it belongs to the same maternal lineage, but without nuclear DNA, the full picture remains just out of reach. So how far did they go? The safe answer is this. Denisovans ranged across most of mainland Asia, from the western slopes of the Altai Mountains to the eastern plains of China, to the southern edges of Indonesia, and perhaps even to Sahul, the combined Ice Age continent of Australia and New Guinea. But the bolder answer, the one the genetic evidence keeps whispering, is that Denisovans were not a fringe population. They were the dominant hominins in Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. From the time Neanderthals ruled Europe, Denisovans ruled Asia. And yet, despite their vast range, they did not leave empires, no monuments, no carvings, no lasting material culture that we can confidently assign to them. Or, perhaps we are just not recognizing it. Many stone tool industries in Asia remain classified as anonymous, the so-called Middle Paleolithic tools of Central Asia and Western China, the flake-based technologies scattered across Southeast Asia. Are they Denisovan, Homo erectus, early Homo sapiens? Without associated bones, we cannot say. But we do know this. Wherever Homo sapiens spread in Asia between 60,000 and 40,000 years ago, Denisovans were already there. Their footprints were already on the land. Their genes were already in the local populations. And then, sometime between 50,000 and 30,000 years ago, they were gone. Not entirely, not genetically, but as a visible population, as a culture, as a name, they faded. Absorbed by waves of Homo sapiens, squeezed by climate shifts at the end of the last glacial maximum, erased by time. But the DNA does not forget. The Denisovans are still here, in blood, in lungs that breathe thin mountain air, in immune systems tuned to ancient pathogens, in fragments of molecular code carried by millions of people alive today, and in a skull that spent 90 years at the bottom of a well, waiting for someone to remember. This is the part of the story where the scientists begin to sweat, quietly, professionally, in that polite academic way. The way where failure is met not with shouting but with sighs, and yet another recalibration of expectations. Because if there is one thing archaeology teaches, it is patience and humility. When the Harbin skull resurfaced in 2018, everyone knew what was at stake. This was not just another fossil. This was one of the most complete archaic human skulls ever found in East Asia. Massive, intact, beautifully preserved. And yet, despite that surface perfection, there was a problem. The skull had no stratigraphic context, no sediments, no surrounding bones, no site data, just the object itself, passed from hand to hand, from well to museum shelf. It was a miracle that it survived, but for geneticists, it was a nightmare. Because DNA is fragile, bone, under the right conditions, can last for hundreds of thousands of years. But DNA is a diva. It hates heat, it hates water, it hates oxygen. It breaks apart in thin chemical threads, snapped by time, gnawed by bacteria, erased by the slow chemistry of decay. In a cold, dry cave, like Denisova, DNA can survive astonishingly well. But in the humid summers of northeastern China, inside a skull passed through human hands for 90 years, the odds were grim. The first attempt was cautious but hopeful. Researchers sampled the petrous bone, the dense inner part of the skull near the ear canal. The petrous is famous among paleogeneticists. It is a vault, the Fort Knox of bone. If DNA survives anywhere in a skull, it survives here. They drilled, processed, amplified, waited. Nothing. They tried the teeth next. Tooth enamel often protects the soft pulp inside, a little cocoon of DNA. It has worked before. Silence. By now, the optimism was thinning. They tried microsampling from multiple cranial sites. They attempted chemical softening of mineral matrices. They even used ultra-sensitive next-generation sequencing techniques, the kind that can pull a genome from a single surviving strand. Again, nothing. The DNA was gone, or mostly gone. This is the point in the story where many teams would have written a polite paper about the failure. Another unfortunate casualty of taphonomy, another fossil that would stay mute. But this team did not stop there. Because there is something that lasts even when DNA falls apart. Proteins. This is the quiet revolution of the last 10 years. Paleoproteomics, the study of ancient proteins. Where DNA is fragile, proteins are resilient. Longer molecular chains, more stable bonds. They survive heat, pressure, and time in ways DNA simply does not. And proteins are not just random molecules, they are coded directly from genes. They are what genes do. They fold into enzymes, structural tissues, and metabolic machinery. A protein is a fingerprint left by a gene, and if you can read that fingerprint, you can read ancestry. The pioneers of this field had already proven the concept. In 2019, proteins from a jawbone found high on the Tibetan plateau, the Xiahe mandible, identified it as Denisovan, even though its DNA was gone. That same year, a jaw dredged from the seafloor off Taiwan yielded Denisovan protein markers. If it worked there, maybe it would work for Harbin. The process is not simple. A single gram of bone is ground into powder, chemicals strip away the minerals. The remaining organic matrix, thin, ghostly, is filtered down to its peptides. Then those fragments are fed into a mass spectrometer, a machine that does not read sequences, but weights, peaks, ratios. Each peak corresponds to a fragment of a protein chain. It looks, at first, like noise, but within the noise are patterns. And with the right reference library, a catalog of protein variants from humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans, chimpanzees, and other great apes, those patterns become data. And the data spoke. Out of 95 proteins recovered from the Harbin skull, 4 carried variants known only from Denisovans. 3 were direct matches to sequences recovered from Denisova cave and the Xiahe jaw. These were not proteins shared with Neanderthals, not shared with Homo sapiens. They were unique to Denisovan lineages. The match was not absolute. Paleoproteomics does not deliver a full genome. It paints with a broad brush. But the direction was clear. Harbin grouped genetically with Denisovans. The proteins were screaming it. Still, the scientists were not satisfied. Protein is good, but DNA is better. DNA contains the fine-grained information proteins cannot. Family trees, individual relationships, gene flow, mutation rates. But where could they find DNA in a skull that had none? There was one place left, one place that most researchers ignore: the dental calculus, hardened plaque, the fossilized remains of ancient mouth bacteria, food particles, and sometimes traces of the host's own DNA, trapped and mineralized before it could decay. It was a long shot. The plaque was sampled from the Harbin skull's single remaining tooth. Tiny flakes, less than 1/3 of a milligram, were dissolved, filtered, and processed. As expected, most of the DNA recovered was bacterial, oral microbiomes from a Pleistocene mouth. But buried within the microbial storm were fragments, human fragments. Mitochondrial DNA, not the full genome, but the matrilineal line. And when compared against the mitochondrial sequences from the Denisova cave specimens, it matched. A clean link, a maternal ancestry that fell squarely within the Denisovan tree. It was not perfect. About 80% of the DNA was contamination, modern human skin cells, bacteria from researchers, fragments left by decades of handling. But the protocols were ready for this. Every contaminant leaves a molecular signature, fragment lengths, chemical damage patterns. Modern DNA is long. Ancient DNA is short, nicked, and chemically scarred in specific ways. When the damaged ancient fragments were isolated, the conclusion held. Harbin's mitochondrial DNA was Denisovan. The relief in the lab must have been electric. After years of failure, a window had opened. A voice had come through. But here is the humility of the field. The researchers knew, and still know, that mitochondrial DNA is only a piece of the puzzle. It tells us about maternal ancestry. It does not tell us about the full nuclear genome. It does not confirm whether Harbin was a typical Denisovan or part of some hybrid branch. But combined with the protein data, the probability was overwhelming. Harbin was Denisovan, the first skull ever recovered that could be confidently tied to the genetic ghost lineage first named from a pinky bone in a Siberian cave 15 years earlier. This was not just a face for the Denisovans. It was a proof of concept for a whole new era in paleogenetics. Because what paleoproteomics teaches us is that the story does not end when DNA fails. The molecules still whisper, the proteins still fold, the calculus still remembers. And in that whisper, an ancient man from 150,000 years ago was no longer anonymous. If you had told a paleogeneticist 20 years ago that the answer to one of the biggest mysteries in human evolution would be found not in the bones, not in the teeth themselves, but in the hardened grime stuck to a tooth, they probably would have laughed. Politely, academically, the way scientists do when something sounds both ridiculous and hauntingly plausible, because science has a strange sense of humor. And yet, here we are. The skull had resisted every attempt to yield its genetic secrets. Petrous bone, empty. Tooth enamel, nothing. Cranial fragments, silent. Even the best methods of ultra-sensitive next-generation sequencing had failed. The DNA was simply gone. Except it wasn't. There was one place left, a place so often overlooked that it rarely makes the checklist of sampling locations in most labs. The dental calculus, fossilized plaque, the hardened residue of ancient biofilm that builds up between teeth, behind molars, along gum lines. A mixture of bacteria, saliva proteins, bits of food, and sometimes, just sometimes, microscopic fragments of the person themselves. It is not elegant. It is not clean. It is not the glamorous image most people have of genetic science. This is not Jurassic Park. This is scraping millennia-old dental gunk with sterile picks under a microscope and praying there is something left that time forgot to destroy. And somehow, there was. When researchers sampled the Harbin skull's single remaining tooth, they were working with less than 1/3 of a milligram of material, just a flake of fossilized plaque, barely visible to the naked eye. But within that flake was a universe. The first result was exactly what anyone would expect. Bacteria, thousands upon thousands of strands, oral microbiomes from a Pleistocene mouth, a snapshot of an ecosystem that lived inside the skull 150,000 years ago. Some of the same bacterial lineages still inhabit human mouths today. Others were ancient strains, long extinct, a biological time capsule in tartar. But hidden among the bacterial storm were fragments of something else, something harder to explain. Short strands, damaged, fragmented, chemically scarred in ways that scream ancient, human DNA. The first reaction, of course, was skepticism. DNA contamination is the ever-present nightmare of ancient genomics. Any fossil handled by human hands, whether museum curators, researchers, or collectors, accumulates modern skin cells. Fingerprints leave DNA. Breathing over a fossil deposits microscopic bits of your genome into its pores. But ancient DNA has a signature. Modern DNA is long, clean, intact. Ancient DNA is shattered, chopped by time into short pieces. Its chemical bonds fray. Its ends accumulate cytosine deamination, a specific type of chemical damage that flags the molecule as genuinely old. These are the markers researchers look for. And in the Harbin plaque, those markers were there. The fragments were short, damaged, chemically ancient. When assembled, the strands formed a partial mitochondrial genome, not nuclear DNA, the full blueprint of a person, but the mitochondrial genome passed from mother to child, a matrilineal fingerprint. And that fingerprint matched. Matched to whom? To the Denisovan sequences first recovered from the Denisova cave pinky bone over a decade earlier. Matched again to the mitochondrial DNA from the Xiahe jawbone on the Tibetan plateau. The Harbin skull's matrilineal ancestry was Denisovan, not Neanderthal, not Homo sapiens, Denisovan. It was one of the most unlikely wins in the history of ancient genetics. A skull that had resisted every conventional method finally yielded its secret from the most unconventional place. A tooth's dirty secret. But the breakthrough came with caution. Mitochondrial DNA is not the same as a full genome. It represents one lineage, the mother's line. It does not account for the father's lineage. It does not measure hybridization or admixture. It cannot, by itself, tell us whether Harbin was a pure Denisovan, a Denisovan-Neanderthal hybrid, or something even more complex. It can, however, confirm belonging, a placement on the maternal branch of the Denisovan family tree, a signal strong enough that the odds of it being random are functionally zero. But how trustworthy is DNA from dental calculus? This is a fair question. It is not traditional, it is not widely used, but the answer is surprisingly strong. Calculus is mineralized biofilm. Once hardened, it forms a crystalline structure similar to bone but denser. It shields embedded organic material from oxygen, water, and microbial attack, the three great destroyers of DNA. Recent studies have shown that dental calculus can sometimes preserve DNA better than bone itself, especially when the bone has been handled extensively, as Harbin had. The irony is brutal. If the skull had been handed directly to scientists in 1933, as soon as it was found, the calculus might have been brushed off, cleaned, polished, removed as debris, but hiding in a well for 90 years, no preservation chemicals, no cleaning, no museum polish, accidentally saved the calculus, and with it, the DNA. A second irony. If the skull had not been handled by so many researchers, collectors, and curators, each adding their own contaminating DNA, the signal from the ancient strands would have been clearer, stronger, easier to read. The contamination was so severe that some researchers joked darkly that they had sequenced themselves more thoroughly than the skull. But the filtering algorithms worked. Modern DNA strands are longer, their damage patterns are different. With enough processing, the ancient fragments rise from the noise, and when they did, the conclusion was inescapable. Harbin was a Denisovan. The mitochondrial DNA aligned with Denisova 3 from the Siberian cave. It also clustered with the Xiahe mandible, a jaw found high on the Tibetan plateau, reinforcing the growing realization that Denisovans were not a local population, but a widespread regionally diverse lineage. This also raised a secondary question. Should Harbin, the most complete Denisovan fossil ever found, now become the type specimen for the species? Should the name Homo longi, proposed in 2021, now become the formal species name for Denisovans? Some argued yes. Under the rules of zoological nomenclature, the first formal description gets the name, and Homo longi had been formally described before the Denisovan identity was genetically confirmed. Others argued no. Denisovans were never a local species confined to Harbin. The name Denisovan honors the Siberian cave where their DNA was first discovered, and many felt it was more appropriate to preserve that historical naming. And still others argued that none of this mattered, that species boundaries among archaic humans are fluid, arbitrary, human-imposed categories. Denisovans, Neanderthals, and Homo sapiens interbred, shared genes, shared landscapes. Perhaps the very concept of neatly bounded species is an illusion, a modern mind's attempt to organize what evolution refuses to make simple. But regardless of the taxonomic debate, one thing was certain. A skull that had spent 90 years at the bottom of a well, that had refused every attempt at conventional DNA extraction, that had survived war, occupation, political upheaval, and the slow gnaw of time, had just revealed its secret. A dirty tooth had cracked open 150,000 years of mystery, and the Denisovans finally had a face. It is one of the most uncomfortable truths in all of paleoanthropology. We do not actually know what a species is, or at least, not in any way that the universe reliably agrees with. The natural world has never read a biology textbook. Evolution does not label its branches, and if there is one thing the Harbin skull has taught us, it is that the species problem is real. When the Harbin skull was first published to the world in the year 2021, it was given a name, Homo longi, the dragon man, a proposed new species of human, distinct from Neanderthals, distinct from Homo sapiens, distinct even from the shadowy Denisovans, whose existence was, at that point, still defined more by DNA than by bones. But the ink was barely dry on that name before the arguments began, and they have not stopped since. Here is the dilemma. Taxonomy, the science of naming and classifying life, depends on criteria. But humans are messy. Ancient humans are even messier. Do we name species based on how fossils look, based on their DNA, on where they lived, on whether they could interbreed, on how much they interbred? Evolution does not care about these boundaries, but scientists have to. At its simplest, the Harbin skull is a taxonomic bombshell because it forces two fields, morphology and genetics, into a very awkward conversation. Morphologists, the scientists who study shape, bone, skull, jaw, teeth, looked at Harbin and saw something both familiar and alien: enormous brow ridges, a brain case as large or larger than most modern humans, a wide, flat face with delicately tucked cheekbones that seemed oddly modern in some ways, and deeply archaic in others. It did not look like a Neanderthal. It did not look like a Homo sapiens, but neither did it look quite like anything else we had seen before. And with that, the argument for a new species, Homo longi, was born. But then came the geneticists, and DNA complicated everything. Because as the DNA trickled in, first from proteins, then from mitochondrial fragments hidden in dental plaque, a picture emerged that was at once exhilarating and frustrating. Harbin matched the Denisovan genome, the same ghost lineage first discovered in a pinky bone from the Denisova cave, the same lineage that left genetic fingerprints in the peoples of Oceania, in Tibetan Highlanders, in East Asians. But what does that mean? Is Homo longi simply a Denisovan? Does that make it the same species? Or was Denisovan itself never a species in the first place? This is the crux of the debate, because Denisovans were never given a formal species name. They were a ghost population, defined entirely by genetics, not by bones. There was never a type specimen, no skull, no skeleton, just DNA from a few teeth, a pinky, a fragment of jaw. And here is Harbin, the most complete Denisovan skull ever found. Should it now be the type specimen for the Denisovan species? And if so, what should that species be called? Homo denisova, Homo longi, or something else entirely? The morphologists point to the physical traits. They argue that Harbin is distinct different enough from Neanderthals, from Homo sapiens, and perhaps even from the Dali skull and the Xiahe mandible to deserve its own species name. Homo longi, a northern cold-adapted cousin with its own evolutionary path. The geneticists are less sure. DNA shows us relationships that bones cannot. Denisovans and Neanderthals split from a common ancestor roughly 500,000 to 400,000 years ago, but they continued to interbreed. Both groups also interbred with Homo sapiens. The lines are not clean. They never were. The very concept of species begins to wobble when confronted with this reality, because by the classic biological definition, if two populations can produce fertile offspring, they are the same species. Then Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans were all the same species, just highly structured, regionally distinct populations of one extended human family. But then there is the practical definition, used in paleontology, where species are defined by morphology, by form, by anatomical distinctiveness. By that standard, Neanderthals are a species, Homo sapiens are a species, and Denisovans might be too, or not. Some researchers argue that Denisovans were never a species in the traditional sense, that they were a metapopulation, a web of interconnected groups spread across Asia, highly diverse, with local adaptations, high-altitude adaptations on the Tibetan Plateau, robust body size in northern climates, perhaps even tropical variants farther south. In this view, Harbin is not the definitive Denisovan. It is one Denisovan, a northern expression of a much larger, messier pattern. Others push back. They argue that the distinctiveness of the Harbin skull, in both size and morphology, is enough to warrant species status. And since Homo longi was the first name formally published, under the rules of zoological nomenclature, it should stick. Denisovan would remain the informal name, the same way we say Neanderthal instead of Homo neanderthalensis. Still others reject the whole framing. The geneticist Svante Pääbo, who pioneered the sequencing of both Neanderthal and Denisovan genomes, has argued bluntly that assigning species names to these groups is not helpful. They were not reproductively isolated. They were not clean branches. They were neighbors, cousins, interbreeding populations whose boundaries were geographical and ecological, not biological. In his view, if we must use a species name, we should simply call them all Homo sapiens, not because they were exactly like us, but because the lines we draw are ours, not nature's. It is an argument that unsettles many in the field, because it forces a kind of humility, a recognition that our need to classify, to label, to draw boundaries may say more about us than about the past we are studying. And yet, taxonomy still matters, for museums, for education, for clarity, for the basic work of communicating who was who in the grand, tangled story of human evolution. For now, the debate remains open. Some papers refer to the Harbin skull as Homo longi, others as Denisovan. Some hedge and say Denisovan population of Homo longi, others refuse to commit at all. The truth is, the fossil record is still too thin. Harbin is a single skull, the Xiahe mandible is a single jaw. The Denisova cave produced fragments, but no complete individuals. Until more is found, the debate will circle, unresolved. But perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps the very existence of Harbin, a skull found in a river city called Dragon River, hidden in a well for 90 years, carrying the genes of a people once known only from shadows, is a reminder that the past does not owe us clarity. It offers us pieces, stories and fragments, a tooth here, a jaw there, a skull that refuses to fit cleanly into any box we try to build for it. And maybe that is enough. There is a dangerous little lie buried inside most textbooks. You have seen it. The tidy diagram of a family tree, branches splitting cleanly from trunks. Homo erectus leads to Homo heidelbergensis, a clean offshoot to Neanderthals. Another splits gracefully into Denisovans. And finally, that proud little line labeled Homo sapiens. A story of clarity, a progression, a ladder, if we are honest with ourselves. But the truth, the messy, brutal, breathtaking truth, is that evolution has never drawn straight lines. It has never obeyed our categories. Never once. For most of the last 1,500,000 years, the genus Homo was not a tree. It was a braided stream, a tangled river delta of populations that split, merged, drifted apart, crashed back together, and sometimes simply vanished. Picture it. Somewhere around 1,500,000 years ago, the world was already full of different kinds of humans. Homo erectus had spread from Africa into Asia. In Europe, early ancestors of Neanderthals were taking shape. In southern Africa, lineages were diverging that would one day lead to us. But none of them were fully separate. Not yet. Across the Old World, populations met and mixed wherever their ranges overlapped. Hybrid zones, places where two lineages blurred together, were the rule, not the exception. Sometimes the mixing was a brief encounter. Other times it lasted for tens of thousands of years. And sometimes, the mixing produced entire new populations that would survive for hundreds of millennia. The DNA agrees. When geneticists sequenced Neanderthal and Denisovan genomes, they found something extraordinary. These two lineages, which had already diverged from their common ancestor with Homo sapiens, were still mixing with each other as recently as 100,000 years ago. Even more shockingly, both were also mixing with populations that are entirely unknown. Ghost lineages. Humans for whom we have no fossils, no names, no faces, just fragments of their genes, embedded in the descendants of others. And it gets stranger, because Homo sapiens, us, were not innocent bystanders to this chaos. Our lineage, emerging from Africa somewhere between 300,000 and 200,000 years ago, immediately began interbreeding with every other human population it met. Neanderthals in the Levant and Europe, Denisovans in Central and East Asia, possibly even with the ghost lineages no one has fully identified. This is not a tree. This is a web, a river delta, a braided stream. The classic biological species concept, that a species is a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring, completely collapses in this context. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens produced fertile offspring. So did Homo sapiens and Denisovans. So did Denisovans and Neanderthals. All of them capable of producing children who were healthy enough to continue the line. So, Were they different species? This is not an idle question. It cuts to the very heart of what it means to be human. If Neanderthals and Denisovans were just regional variants of us, then the idea that Homo sapiens is unique begins to wobble. If they were true species, distinct, bounded, separate, then their extinction feels like a clearer dividing line. But if they were somewhere in between, then the lines between us and them are not just blurry, they are imaginary. Enter the braided stream model. It proposes that for most of the Pleistocene, from 1,500,000 to 50,000 years ago, there were never clean splits. Instead, there were populations, each adapted to their geography, their climate, their food sources, their challenges. Some diverged further than others. Some remained connected through gene flow, others isolated for a time, only to reconnect centuries or millennia later. The Denisovans are a perfect case study. Their DNA shows deep splits between populations. The Denisovans of the Siberian cave are genetically different from the Denisovan-related lineage that contributed genes to modern Papuans and Aboriginal Australians. And that lineage, in turn, is different from the Denisovan signals found in Tibetans, the one that carries the EPAS1 gene for high-altitude adaptation. This is not the footprint of a single homogeneous species. It is the footprint of a population complex, a braided stream of Denisovan groups, each evolving locally, mixing occasionally, diverging, converging, and dispersing. And Harbin, the Dragon Man, slots into this picture as one branch of that stream. A northern Denisovan, perhaps adapted to the cold river valleys of northeastern China. Perhaps part of a larger northern population that spread from the Tibetan plateau to the frozen forests of the north. The same pattern repeats with Neanderthals. Western European Neanderthals were genetically different from those in Central Asia. Those in the Caucasus different again. Some Neanderthal populations vanished entirely, replaced by others in waves of migration we barely understand. And Homo sapiens? Not exempt. Our own species began as a braided stream within Africa. Different groups, isolated by deserts, mountains, and vast distances, diverged and reconnected countless times before the eventual migrations out of Africa. The DNA record shows it clearly. There was no single Adam, no single Eve, just populations, moving, splitting, mixing, surviving. So, are species even real? The honest answer is yes and no. In the day-to-day business of biology, species are a useful tool. They help us categorize. They help us communicate. They describe patterns we can observe in living organisms. But in deep time, in the tangled depths of human evolution, species become more like chapters in a story we are writing after the fact. Nature did not write those chapters. We did. And the Harbin skull, with its tangled mix of archaic and modern features, with its Denisovan mitochondrial DNA, with its outsized brain and strange blend of traits, is a perfect reminder that the story we are writing is always a draft, always subject to revision. If evolution teaches us anything, it is this: the lines are never clean. They were never meant to be. Life does not care about our categories. It cares about survival, about adaptation, about moving, thriving, and passing genes to the next generation. Whether those genes come from a neighbor, a stranger, or a distant cousin last seen 10,000 years ago, evolution shrugs. The stream flows on. So perhaps it is time to retire the tree, to stop pretending the branches are neat, to embrace the river, the tangle, the truth that we are, and always have been, a species made of mixtures, braided together from lineages that stretch back through the Ice Age, through the stone tools, through the fires on the plains, through the frozen caves and tropical forests, all the way to the first footprints that were not yet quite human, but were walking toward something new. There is something unsettling about the skulls from the northern plains of ancient China, something that defies expectations. They are massive, not just in face or brow or bone thickness, though those are all true, but in what they hold. The cranial capacity. The Harbin skull, as we have seen, measures around 1,420 cubic centimeters, already on the higher end of modern humans. But then, there are others. At Shujia, an archaeological site not far south from Harbin, the reconstructed skulls point toward individuals with cranial volumes reaching 1,700, even 1,800 cubic centimeters. Xuchang, another fossil site in central China, shows the same. Skulls so large that if found today, they would be considered outliers, statistical freaks, the kind of brain size that modern medicine sometimes links to rare developmental anomalies. And yet, these were normal for their time. Normal, or common enough to be seen repeatedly. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Why? Why would a population evolve brains larger than most humans alive today? Why the thick skull walls, the massive chewing muscles, the heavy brow ridges framing those deep square eye sockets? What pressure, what selective force could have sculpted a people like this? Let us start with the obvious. Does brain size equal intelligence? No, and maybe. In modern humans, the correlation between absolute brain size and intelligence is weak at best. A person with a 1,400 cubic centimeter brain is not inherently smarter than someone with 1,300. Intelligence is distributed. It is shaped by brain structure, connectivity, experience, culture, and yes, sheer luck. Some of the most creative and capable humans in history had below-average brain volumes, and some individuals with enormous brains did not change the world. But in evolutionary terms, bigger brains are not free. They are expensive. Your brain burns about 20% of your body's calories, an outrageous metabolic cost for a single organ. If a population evolves larger brains, something is driving that cost. So what was it? The first answer might be climate. The Shujia and Xuchang fossils date to a period when northern China was swinging through glacial and interglacial cycles. Harbin itself, situated along the Songhua River, would have endured long, brutal winters. Even during warmer interglacial phases, the region would have seen punishing cold, wind, and food scarcity. Here, physics steps in. Bergmann's rule, a principle in biology that states animals in colder climates tend to be larger-bodied than their warm climate relatives, applies to humans too. A larger body retains heat better. Less surface area relative to mass means slower heat loss. Neanderthals followed this rule, short, stocky, heavy-set. And the Harbin man may have followed it too. But larger bodies also come with larger heads, and therein lies part of the explanation. A large brain case might not have evolved for cognitive superiority, but as a byproduct of a larger, more cold-adapted body. Thick bone walls to insulate against the cold. Massive chewing muscles not just for raw meat or roots, but perhaps to help thermoregulate. Chewing stimulates heat production. But even that does not fully explain it, because the Shujia and Xuchang skulls are not merely scaled-up Homo sapiens. Their proportions are different. The faces are flatter, wider, the brain case is elongated, the brow ridges pronounced not like Neanderthals, who show a characteristic arch, but squared, shelf-like, as if someone sculpted them with a ruler rather than a compass. It suggests that this was not just cold adaptation. Something else was at play. Perhaps it was dietary. The northern plains were rich in megafauna during the Pleistocene, wild horses, woolly rhinos, deer, and steppe bison. Processing that diet meant heavy chewing, often of frozen meat, sinew, and raw marrow. The robust mandibles seen in Harbin and his cousins match this, a skull designed to support massive chewing forces over a lifetime. There is another theory, less glamorous but compelling: path dependency. If an ancestral population evolved larger bodies for cold adaptation, and larger skulls as a side effect, then larger brain size follows, even if it is not under direct selection for intelligence. The brain grows to fill the space available, not because it needs to be larger, but because evolution often builds with what is already there. It is a form of evolutionary inertia. The brain, like any organ, does not evolve in isolation. Skull shape, jaw mechanics, thermoregulation, all interact. The result is not always optimal. It is simply workable, survivable. But even this might not tell the full story. There is something else lurking in the fossil record, a pattern that stretches beyond Harbin, Shujia, and Shuchang, a pattern seen in the Dali skull, in the Xiahe mandible on the Tibetan plateau, in Denisova cave, a pattern of robust, large-bodied, big-brained humans spread across northern and central Asia from around 300,000 to 100,000 years ago. Was this a single population, a lineage, or simply a repeated solution to similar problems? We do not yet know. But the scale of it forces us to confront something profound. For a very long time, the dominant humans of northern Asia were not Homo sapiens, not even Neanderthals. They were this, a lineage, or perhaps a braided stream of lineages that produced skulls like Harbin, bodies perhaps tipping 100 kilograms, heights approaching 1.8 meters, faces broad and flat, set beneath brain cases that would shame most of us today. And then, they were gone. Why? That question waits for another chapter. But for now, what Harbin and his cousins teach us is that there are many ways to be human, that the shape of a skull, or the size of a brain, is not destiny. It is a map of challenges met, of winters endured, of calories hunted, gathered, and burned, a map of lives lived under a sky very much like ours, but in a world that no longer exists. Does brain size mean intelligence? Perhaps a little, but mostly, it means survival, in a place where fire was never quite enough, where the wind carved the bones as surely as time, where being human meant being big. It is an old story, one so old, in fact, that every culture seems to remember it in some shape or form, the story of giants, of humans so large, so strange, so physically overwhelming, that their bones became the stuff of legend. But what happens when the bones are real? When you stand before the skull from Harbin, or look at the cranial reconstructions from Shujia and Shuchang, the idea of giants starts to feel less mythical, not supernatural, not fantastical, but very real in the humble, stubborn way that bones are real. Massive brow ridges, enormous jawbones, cranial capacities reaching 1,800 cubic centimeters, not fairy tales, fossils. And yet, across history, discoveries like this have repeatedly slipped out of the hands of science and into the waiting arms of myth. The idea that there was once a race of giants walking the earth is not new. It stretches back thousands of years. The Bible speaks of the Nephilim. Norse sagas whisper of the Jotnar. Greek legends tell of the Titanomachy, a war between gods and giants. Even the folklore of China, where the Harbin skull was eventually found, contains echoes of immense beings, sometimes called the Kui, or earth giants, beings tied to mountains and rivers. Is it coincidence or memory? Paleoanthropology offers one answer, and it begins with an observation both obvious and profound. The Pleistocene was a world of big things. Megafauna dominated every continent not yet touched by modern Homo sapiens. Mammoths, mastodons, woolly rhinoceroses, cave bears, giant ground sloths. And in this world of giants, some humans were giants too. But giants in the biological sense, not in the supernatural one. Take the Harbin man, a skull so large that it would sit uncomfortably both literally and metaphorically next to the average human today. A man likely pushing 100 kilograms in body mass, perhaps 1.8 meters tall or more. A wide, flat face framed by a brain case larger than almost anyone walking the earth now. Or look at the fossil population at Shujia. Skulls reconstructed with volumes of 1,700, even 1,800 cubic centimeters. The heavy zygomatic arches, the sheer mass of the occipital bone. These were not simply tall people, they were robust, engineered by the slow hand of evolution for cold, for physicality, for survival in a harsh world. And yet, here is where the misunderstanding creeps in. Because when bones like this are unearthed as they have been for centuries, they rarely land first in the lap of science. Before there were paleontologists, there were farmers, miners, soldiers, priests, people whose framework for understanding the past was shaped not by evolutionary theory, but by myth, religion, and oral storytelling. A femur the size of a log does not whisper of climate adaptation to the average shepherd in the year 1500. It shouts of giants. A massive skull unearthed from the banks of the Yellow River does not say Denisovan, it says dragon. And the confusion persists into the modern day. Fossils like Harbin, Shujia, and Shuchang have been repeatedly misappropriated by pseudoscience. Fringe theories argue that these are proof of lost civilizations, of ancient giants erased from mainstream history. Some even twist the narrative toward racial pseudoscience, claiming these fossils represent a superior human lineage, more intelligent, more advanced, lost to time. None of this is true, but the impulse is deeply human. Because the truth is that the line between fact and folklore has always been thin. When the first Denisovan jawbone surfaced from the Tibetan plateau, a jaw so massive that its molars dwarf those of any modern human, the researchers themselves struggled to place it. For a brief moment, the question hung in the air. Was this another species, a variant of Neanderthal, or something altogether stranger? It was, in the end, something both extraordinary and deeply mundane. A Denisovan, a human adapted to a world most of us cannot even imagine. Thin air, ice, endless grasslands. The same applies to Harbin, a skull that, in isolation, might have fed centuries of folklore. But placed into context, archaeological, genetic, environmental, it becomes something better than a myth. It becomes a window into a forgotten chapter of what it means to be human. And that is the quiet miracle of this science, because it does not reduce the world, it expands it. Yes, there were giants, but they were not monsters, not titans. They were humans, made by the same process that made you and me, sculpted by wind and ice and hunger. Their size was a strategy, not a mystery. Bigger bodies hold heat better, bigger jaws process tougher foods, thicker bones survive colder climates. And yes, their brains were enormous, but not because they were gods, because evolution is lazy. It reuses what works. A bigger skull means more brain tissue, whether needed or not, whether used for strategy or simply for surviving the brutal arithmetic of Ice Age winters. So why do we keep turning big humans into legends? Because stories are how we metabolize the impossible. The awe of seeing a skull that does not look quite like ours. The unease of realizing that the past was full of humans who were not us, and yet were. We tell stories of giants because deep down, we suspect the truth. That we are not the beginning of the story. We are a footnote, a recent chapter in a much longer, stranger, more tangled narrative. And the Harbin skull, dragged from a well after 90 years in the dark, is a reminder of just how much of that story we have forgotten. Science then becomes an act of humility. It says, yes, these were giants, but they were giants for reasons we can understand. Climate, diet, evolution, chance. Not because the world was once magical and then stopped being magical, but because it has always been magical in the only way that matters, through the cold, elegant, relentless logic of survival. And that perhaps is better than any myth. To imagine the world of Dragon Man, you first have to let go of everything you think you know about landscapes, about climates, and about what it meant to be human. Because northeastern China, 150,000 years ago, was a place so unlike today, and yet disturbingly familiar in all the wrong ways. Begin with the climate. It was Ice Age Earth, not the peak glacial coldest of cold, but an unforgiving glacial interglacial rhythm, swinging between brief windows of warmth and long, brutal epochs of cold. The Songhua River, where the Harbin skull was ultimately discovered, flowed through open grasslands punctuated by dense boreal forests. Winters were harsh, with temperatures sinking far below freezing for months on end. Snow cover persisted through most of the year. Summers were brief, lush, and violent. Thunderstorms, flooding rivers, mosquito plagues. It was a continent of contrast, a landscape where survival was not about thriving, but enduring. And it was loud. Imagine it. The trumpeting of woolly mammoths moving across the plains, herds of giant elk, megaserine deer with antlers wider than a grown man is tall, the heavy, bone-shaking footsteps of woolly rhinoceroses scraping frost from the ground with their massive horns. In the distance, the deep rumbling growl of cave hyenas, predators the size of modern lions, but bulkier, more relentless, specialized for cracking bone. This was a megafaunal world, one that had not yet learned to fear humans. And it wasn't just the animals, because Dragon Man was not alone. At this moment in prehistory, the planet was shared by at least 4 distinct human lineages. Far to the west were the Neanderthals, dominating Europe and parts of the Middle East. Southward, Homo sapiens, our direct ancestors, were emerging from Africa, tentatively spreading into the Levant. Somewhere in the high-altitude plateaus of Central Asia roamed the mysterious Denisovans, of which Harbin very likely was one. And scattered throughout pockets of Southeast Asia, relic populations like Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbits, persisted on isolated islands. It was a crowded world, a world of cousins. And yet, in this corner of northern China, Dragon Man's kin may have been alone in their immediate landscape, the dominant humans of their biome. But being dominant didn't mean being comfortable. Every day was a negotiation with death. Start with the predators. Smilodon was long extinct in Asia by now, but its ecological niche was well filled by other big cats, the Panthera lineage. Giant Asian lions, saber-tooth-like tigers whose fossils are found in northern China from this very period. Packs of dire wolves. Even more terrifying, the short-faced bear, Arctodus, capable of standing over 3.5 meters tall on hind legs, weighing upwards of 900 kilograms. One swipe could snap a human spine like a twig. But the most dangerous predator was cold. Fire was not optional. It was life. The archaeological record from similar Denisovan sites shows a near-constant reliance on fire. Hearths dotted the living spaces. The smell of smoke would have clung to their hair, their skins, their tools. Keeping the fire alive was more than a chore. It was the central organizing principle of survival. Then there was food. Hunting was dangerous and difficult. Mammoths, rhinoceroses, elk, all tempting, but hunting megafauna was not a daily event. More often, the diet consisted of smaller game. Deer, rabbits, ground birds, fish pulled from ice-fringed rivers. Foraging filled the gaps. Nuts, tubers, berries in the short summer, edible roots dug from frozen ground in winter. But even food had consequences. The wear patterns on Denisovan molars suggest a lifetime of chewing abrasive material. Not just meat, but sinew, hide, raw roots, perhaps even bones cracked for marrow. The Harbin skull's thick jaws were not ornamental. They were the machinery of survival. And then, there were the tools. This was not a world of fine craftsmanship. The Middle Pleistocene toolkits were pragmatic, simple, and robust. Heavy-duty hand axes, scrapers made from locally sourced quartzite or chert, blades chipped hastily from river cobbles. A functional technology, not elegant, but effective. Fire-hardened wooden spears likely filled out the arsenal, though none survive in the fossil record from this site. What did a day look like for Dragon Man? Dawn would break cold, even in summer. The fire must be fed, dry branches scavenged from frost-hardened shrubs. Someone is always watching the tree line for movement. Is it prey, or something hunting the hunters? Midday would be filled with labor, tanning hides, shaping stone, checking the snares. But always, the decision hangs over the camp. Hunt or stay, risk or conserve. Hunting meant venturing far, kilometers through snow or mud. It meant moving as a group, reading the tracks of bison herds, knowing the paths the elk take to drink. It meant failure. Most hunts were. It meant danger. One misstep near a startled rhino could end a life in seconds. Evenings brought the return to fire. Meat, if any, was shared. Bones were cracked. Fat was prized above all, a dense, energy-rich currency that fueled bodies through long, lean months. Songs, perhaps, if songs existed then. Stories, or at least grunts that would one day become stories. Children wrestling in the mud, learning how to throw. Elders sharpening tools worn down to nubs. And always, the night. A night darker than any you have ever seen. No cities, no light pollution, just the glow of fire, the shimmer of the aurora over the plains, and the constant unnerving knowledge that in the shadows beyond the firelight, things moved. Could you survive this world? Maybe, maybe not. Modern humans are adaptable, yes, but we are also fragile. Take away electricity, agriculture, antibiotics, and you quickly realize that what we call civilization is a thin, trembling crust over the much older foundation of survival that Dragon Man knew intimately. His world was brutal, beautiful, alive in ways ours is forgotten. And for hundreds of thousands of years, it was home. But even food had consequences. The wear patterns on Denisovan molars suggest a lifetime of chewing abrasive material. Not just meat, but sinew, hide, raw roots, perhaps even bones cracked for marrow. The Harbin skull's thick jaws were not ornamental. They were the machinery of survival. And then, there were the tools. This was not a world of fine craftsmanship. The Middle Pleistocene toolkits were pragmatic, simple, and robust. Heavy-duty hand axes, scrapers made from locally sourced quartzite or chert, blades chipped hastily from river cobbles. A functional technology, not elegant, but effective. Fire-hardened wooden spears likely filled out the arsenal, though none survive in the fossil record from this site. What did a day look like for Dragon Man? Dawn would break cold, even in summer. The fire must be fed, dry branches scavenged from frost-hardened shrubs. Someone is always watching the tree line for movement. Is it prey, or something hunting the hunters? Midday would be filled with labor, tanning hides, shaping stone, checking the snares. But always, the decision hangs over the camp. Hunt or stay, risk or conserve. Hunting meant venturing far, kilometers through snow or mud. It meant moving as a group, reading the tracks of bison herds, knowing the paths the elk take to drink. It meant failure. Most hunts were. It meant danger. One misstep near a startled rhino could end a life in seconds. Evenings brought the return to fire. Meat, if any, was shared. Bones were cracked. Fat was prized above all, a dense, energy-rich currency that fueled bodies through long, lean months. Songs, perhaps, if songs existed then. Stories, or at least grunts that would one day become stories. Children wrestling in the mud, learning how to throw. Elders sharpening tools worn down to nubs. And always, the night. A night darker than any you have ever seen. No cities, no light pollution, just the glow of fire, the shimmer of the aurora over the plains, and the constant unnerving knowledge that in the shadows beyond the firelight, things moved. Could you survive this world? Maybe, maybe not. Modern humans are adaptable, yes, but we are also fragile. Take away electricity, agriculture, antibiotics, and you quickly realize that what we call civilization is a thin, trembling crust over the much older foundation of survival that Dragon Man knew intimately. His world was brutal, beautiful, alive in ways ours is forgotten. And for hundreds of thousands of years, it was home. Encounters between groups may have ended in trade, in knowledge shared around fire, or they may have ended with broken skulls, spears in the rib cage, a warning painted in blood across the snow. We simply do not know. The archaeology whispers both possibilities. There is one more wrinkle in the story. Genetic models suggest that Denisovans were not a single, unified group. They were a patchwork of subpopulations, some closely related to the Denisovans of Siberia, others more distinct, perhaps representing ancient divergences dating back hundreds of thousands of years. The Harbin skull may represent one such lineage, a northern branch, isolated by glaciers and mountains, a people whose bodies grew larger, whose skulls grew thicker, whose faces adapted to cold wind and relentless winters. But were they alone? Almost certainly not. Because across the Yellow River were the Dali people, somewhere beyond the forests, perhaps Maba's kin. And beyond the horizon, Homo sapiens were coming, not yet in force, but soon. This was a world on the cusp, a world where species lines blurred, where isolation was always temporary, where prehistory was crowded in ways modern humans have mostly forgotten. Could you have told them apart? A Denisovan standing next to a Neanderthal next to an early Homo sapiens. The differences were real, measurable in bones, in genes, but subtle to the eye. Robust jaws here, Thinner brow ridges there, skin perhaps darker or lighter depending on region, nose shapes adapted to humidity or cold, but the same hands, the same eyes, the same calloused feet walking over ice and mud. And somewhere in that picture, the Harbin man, not a relic, not an anomaly, but a participant in this vast, tangled drama of cousins, a member of a family whose branches had not yet been pruned by extinction. In his time, the world was still wide open, the future unwritten. What did they think of each other, these humans? Did they have words for stranger, for enemy, for friend? Did they see each other as different, or simply as others? Did they ever wonder, as we do now, how crowded the future might one day become? If you stood on the icy plains of northeastern Asia 90,000 years ago, you would not have known it was ending. Not yet. To the eyes of those alive then, the giant-browed humans we now call Denisovans, nothing seemed unusual. The mammoths still roamed, the snow still fell, the fires still burned. But something was changing. The fossil record does not offer clean answers. It does not whisper endings the way it whispers beginnings. There is no fossil labeled the last Denisovan, no single grave, no moment when they looked up at the sky and realized the story was closing. Instead, what we see is the slow unraveling of presence, a ghosting from the landscape of deep time. One by one, the signs fade. But why? Why did a population that spanned from Siberia to southern China, a lineage so successful it survived over 300,000 years, vanish? Why them, and not others? Let us begin with the climate. The period between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago was one of escalating instability. Glacial cycles intensified. The world swung between brief, deceptive bursts of warmth and crushing, long winters that swallowed entire landscapes in ice. The Mammoth Steppe, that vast belt of rich grasslands stretching from France to Alaska, began to contract. Forests advanced and retreated like breathing lungs. Rivers shifted. Game patterns broke. For populations like the Denisovans, heavily adapted to northern latitudes, these were existential threats. They had survived cold before, but not this kind of chaos. Not this quickly. Their large bodies, their wide faces, their enormous lungs, all perfectly tuned for high altitudes and freezing plains, now became liabilities in warmer, wetter interglacial corridors. But it was not just the climate. It was the neighbors. By 60,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, us, were on the move. No longer confined to Africa, our ancestors had reached the Arabian Peninsula, then India, then Southeast Asia, then Australia. A pulse of expansion, moving faster and farther than any hominin before, equipped with finer tools, projectiles, art, language, and something else, the capacity for rapid, flexible adaptation. Where Denisovans specialized, Homo sapiens generalized. Where Denisovans mastered their own ecological niche, Homo sapiens invented new ones. It was not an invasion in the way modern minds picture. There were no armies, no front lines. Instead, it was a slow, steady seepage, river valley by river valley, coastline by coastline, a creeping tide of new humans whose arrival meant subtle, devastating competition for every scarce thing the Denisovans needed. And then, there was sex. The genetic record is clear. Denisovans did not simply vanish. They interbred, frequently and deeply, with Homo sapiens and with Neanderthals. Their genes still live on. Today, billions of people across Asia, Oceania, and the Americas carry Denisovan fragments in their DNA. In Papua New Guinea, it amounts to nearly 5% of the genome. Even in parts of East Asia, small echoes remain, silent passengers in the double helix of modern humans. Did the Denisovans go extinct, or were they absorbed? It depends on how you define existence. A population can disappear as a culture, as a language, as a body type, as a way of being in the world, but their biological essence can persist, braided invisibly into the future, a whisper in the bloodstreams of descendants who no longer remember the shape of the face it came from. Yet even with hybridization, the archaeology is clear. Something was lost. By 40,000 years ago, there are no more Denisovan fossils, no more tools left by their hands, no more teeth dropped in the caves of Siberia. They are gone, from the Earth, if not from the genome. But there is one more suspect in this crime of deep time, one that is quieter, but no less lethal. Isolation. The Denisovans were a fragmented people. Genetic studies reveal that even when they flourished, their populations were divided. Highland Denisovans in Tibet, lowland Denisovans in northern China, ocean-bordering Denisovans near Taiwan. Small, scattered bands separated by thousands of kilometers of unforgiving terrain. In biology, this is called the effective population size. It is not how many individuals are alive. It is how many are breeding, regularly mixing, keeping the gene pool healthy. When groups become isolated, diversity collapses. Inbreeding rises. Genetic load accumulates. Harmful mutations that would otherwise be purged now slip through. A harsh winter here. A failed hunting season there. A flood. A disease. It does not take an apocalypse to erase a species. Just math. The end, when it came, was probably not dramatic. No war, no singular catastrophe. Just emptier campsites, fewer fires, the silence of unreturned footprints in snow. A child dies, and there is no sibling to follow. A hunting party vanishes, and no one remembers where. It ends, as most things end, quietly, and yet, not entirely. The Denisovans persist, not as they were, but as a ghost species, folded into us. Their genes shape how some modern humans adapt to high altitudes. They whisper in immune systems tuned to ancient viruses. They exist in your blood if you are from East Asia, or Polynesia, or the first peoples of the Americas. And their skull, the Harbin skull, now rests not in a forgotten well, but in a museum, studied, measured, argued over. Their face, once invisible to science, is now ours to remember. The last Denisovan did not know they were the last. And perhaps, neither will we. It is one of the strangest mysteries in the study of ancient DNA, a question that should not exist, and yet refuses to go away. If the Denisovans lived here, in East Asia, for hundreds of thousands of years, why do East Asians carry almost none of their DNA? Why is it that the people of Papua New Guinea and parts of Australia, places where no Denisovan fossils have ever been found, hold the highest traces of this ancient lineage, while the descendants of the Denisovans' home turf seem to have lost them entirely? It is not a small difference. Papuan genomes can carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA. Indigenous Australians carry nearly as much. Some Philippine populations, like the Aita Magbukan, carry even higher fractions. Yet across East Asia, China, Korea, Japan, Mongolia, the signature nearly vanishes. A fraction of a percent. Background noise. A genetic whisper, barely there. And it should not be this way. The fossil map is clear. The Harbin skull, Denisovan. The Xiahe jaw on the Tibetan plateau, Denisovan. The Penghu jaw dredged from the sea floor off Taiwan, very likely Denisovan. The Denisovan presence is painted across East Asia in giant, unmistakable strokes. So why do their genes not match their geography? The answer is not simple. Start with the basic rules of population genetics. Every gene is a survivor, but survival is not guaranteed. It is a lottery of who breeds, who migrates, and who outnumbers whom. A wave of migration can erase the genetic footprint of an entire people, not through war, not through genocide, but simply through numbers, birth by birth, child by child, generation by generation. And that is likely what happened here. By around 50,000 years ago, the Homo sapiens expansion out of Africa was no longer a trickle. It was a flood. Modern humans did not enter East Asia once. They entered multiple times, in waves, some earlier, some later. Each wave carried a slightly different blend of ancestry, each with different levels of Neanderthal DNA, Denisovan DNA, and whatever local populations they mixed with. But then came the final waves, the ones that matter most for the present-day genetic landscape. These were not just Homo sapiens anymore. These were hybrid humans. populations already blended with Neanderthals in the Middle East, with earlier Homo sapiens populations in South Asia, and perhaps with other archaic humans we still have not named. When this final wave surged into East Asia, something strange happened. It did not fully mix with the Denisovan-descended populations already living there, or if it did, it replaced them so thoroughly that the Denisovan genetic signature shrank to almost nothing. This phenomenon is called genetic replacement, not extinction in the sense of vanishing off the map, but extinction in the sense of being outnumbered, diluted, overridden. 1,000 ancestors replaced by 10,000 newcomers. A forest overtaken not by fire, but by faster-growing trees. We have seen it before. It is written all over the story of Homo sapiens. In Europe, early modern humans like the Goyet population were nearly wiped from the gene pool by later Gravettian and then Magdalenian expansions. In Africa itself, ancient populations were overwritten repeatedly by waves of Bantu-speaking peoples spreading agriculture. In North America, the ancient Paleo-Eskimo genomes were almost entirely replaced by later Neo-Eskimo and Inuit migrations. So why do Papuans and Australians preserve so much Denisovan DNA? Because they left. The ancestors of Papuans and indigenous Australians did something that the ancestors of East Asians did not. They escaped the replacement. Around 50,000 years ago, a group of modern humans left mainland Asia, skirted along the coastlines of Southeast Asia, and crossed the ancient land bridges into Sahul, the supercontinent of Australia and New Guinea when sea levels were lower. There, they mixed heavily with Denisovan-descended populations, likely different from the ones in Siberia or northern China, perhaps a southern branch of Denisovans adapted to island environments. And then, the doors closed. Rising seas isolated them. Later waves of Homo sapiens never reached them in numbers large enough to overwrite their genetic signature. In contrast, East Asia remained open, wide open, to wave after wave after wave of migration. Each wave carried fewer Denisovan genes than the last. Some perhaps carried none. It is not just theory. The genetics tell the story. Studies show that the tiny Denisovan signal in East Asians is not the same as the one in Papuans. They come from different branches, evidence of at least 2, possibly 3, distinct Denisovan populations that Homo sapiens encountered. One in northern Asia, one in the tropics, maybe one further east still, perhaps even touching the Americas. But in the north, in China, in Korea, in Mongolia, the story is one of erasure. We do not know the names of the populations who did it. Their bones are still waiting. Their languages are long dead. Their stories are gone. But their genomes remain. Modern East Asians carry a genetic profile shaped by this final sweep, a population that, for whatever reason, carried almost no Denisovan ancestry. The reasons could be geography. The Denisovans were adapted to cold, to highlands, to specific niches that disappeared as climates shifted. It could be culture, differences in technology, language, or cooperation that allowed one group to outcompete another. Or it could simply be the brutal arithmetic of numbers. More babies, more tribes, more mouths eating the same game. And there is one more possibility, a possibility scientists whisper but do not yet know how to prove. That Denisovan-descended populations in East Asia did not simply vanish into Homo sapiens, that instead, some were absorbed into the final wave of Neanderthal hybrids that came from the West. That the Homo sapiens who swept through East Asia carried not only the blood of Neanderthals, but of earlier Denisovan Neanderthal hybrids, a mixing far older than anyone suspected. It is a theory still debated. The genetics hint at it. Some East Asian genomes carry odd fragments, pieces that look Denisovan, but do not match the Denisovan DNA from Siberia or from Papuan ancestry. Ghost lineages, remnants of populations never found, never named. Perhaps the Denisovan story in East Asia is not a story of extinction. Perhaps it is a story of fusion, of the ghosts of Denisovans, Neanderthals, and Homo sapiens all blurring together into the modern faces walking the streets of Beijing, Seoul, Tokyo, and beyond. The Harbin skull is gone from the gene pool, but not all of him. Not entirely. The echoes remain. Faint, fragmentary, hard to find, but real. The real mystery is not why the Denisovans disappeared. The The real mystery is how much of them still survives in ways we have not yet learned to see. Science has a funny way of humbling itself. One discovery, a skull, a tooth, a whisper of DNA, and suddenly, the maps must be redrawn. The family tree collapses. Labels once printed in textbooks begin to flicker, shift, and dissolve. And nothing does this more dramatically than the fossil now known as the Harbin skull or Dragon Man, because what that skull has done is force paleoanthropology to turn back toward itself, crack open the museum drawers, and ask a rather uncomfortable question. What if we've been mislabeling fossils for almost a century? This is not hypothetical anymore. The evidence is now sitting on the lab tables. Because if the Harbin skull, massive, wide-faced, robust, and for decades simply an anonymous mystery skull, can suddenly be identified through a single smear of ancient plaque as a Denisovan, then what does that mean for the others? The others, the lonely, the outliers, the fossils that never quite fit. It starts with Dali. The Dali skull was found in 1978 in Shanxi province, central China, a remarkably well-preserved cranium dating to around 260,000 years ago. For decades, it was a puzzle, too modern to be Homo erectus, too primitive to be Homo sapiens, and lacking the Neanderthal features that would make things easy. Some called it Homo daliensis. Others argued it was just a regional variant of Homo heidelbergensis. Others quietly shoved it to the edges of the discussion, hoping time would solve it. But the Harbin skull changed that. Its massive face, the shape of its eye sockets, the sweep of its brow ridge, the proportions of its brain case, nearly a mirror of Dali. And then there is Jinyushan, found in 1984 in Liaoning province, northeastern China, dated to about 260 to 280,000 years ago. A skull with a brain capacity nearly as large as modern humans, 1,350 cubic centimeters, with an enormous face, thick brow ridges, and no easy label. Was it archaic Homo sapiens, a late Homo erectus, or something else entirely? Suddenly, that something else is not so vague. The comparisons to Harbin are immediate. The cheekbones, the midface, the way the skull vault flattens at the top, all features now recognizable as Denisovan signatures, or at least highly suspect. And then there is Hexion, found in 1972 in Anhui province, smaller, stranger, sometimes lumped with Homo erectus, sometimes treated as an evolutionary leftover. But its strange mosaic of traits, primitive in some ways, surprisingly derived in others, now raises an inevitable question. Were these people Denisovans too? This is not just armchair speculation anymore. As of the year 2025, teams in Beijing, in Copenhagen, in Leipzig, and across the world are reopening the analyses, dusting off jawbones, rescanning teeth, scraping off ancient plaque in the hope that the miracle of the Harbin skull, DNA and proteins preserved in the calculus, might repeat itself. Because here is the dirty secret of paleoanthropology. Most fossils have no DNA. It is not anyone's fault. The conditions for DNA preservation are rare. Permafrost, deep caves, desiccated deserts, and East Asia is none of those. Warm, wet, erosive. In East Asia, DNA dies quickly, and for decades, that meant the Denisovans were ghost humans, a genome without a skeleton, a pinky bone without a face. Until now. The Harbin skull cracked the door open, and what it revealed is forcing every researcher to go back, not just to the fossils in East Asia, but to the entire global fossil record, asking, have we underestimated how widespread the Denisovans really were? Because if Dali and Jinyushan are Denisovans or even just cousins, that means the Denisovans were not some small, isolated mountain tribe tucked into Siberia. They were the dominant hominin of East Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. It also means that the story we've been telling about Homo sapiens entering East Asia 50,000 years ago, finding the land empty except for a few scattered groups, is fiction. The land was not empty. It was full of robust, big-brained humans who had survived ice ages, megafauna, climate collapse, and competition from other archaic species for 500,000 years. There are even more outliers waiting for reassessment. Take Maba Man, found in 1958 near Guangzhou in southern China. A partial skull cap with Neanderthal-like features but also similarities to Dolly and Harbin. For years it was dismissed as an anomaly. Now, not so much. Or the Penghu jaw, dredged from the sea floor off Taiwan. Massive, heavy, with molars nearly as large as the Denisovan teeth from Siberia. No DNA, yet. But in light of Harbin, its identity feels less mysterious than it did a decade ago. There is also Shujiayao, a site with multiple fragmentary skulls from northern China, dated between 120,000 and 180,000 years ago. Huge cranial capacities, some over 1,700 cubic centimeters. Faces robust beyond Neanderthal standards. And again, no clean fit. Were they Homo sapiens? Homo erectus? Or something else? The pattern is impossible to ignore. All across East Asia, from the Yellow River to the Tibetan Plateau to the island shelves now underwater, the bones tell a story that does not match the old categories. Not Homo erectus, not Neanderthal, not quite Homo sapiens. Something else, something big, something robust, something Denisovan, or at least something braided from the same evolutionary stream. This is where the limits of language start to break. Are we talking about Denisovans in the strict sense, the exact lineage whose DNA was sequenced from Denisova Cave? Or are we looking at a wider family, a population network that included multiple subgroups, multiple hybrids, overlapping lineages that defy the word species entirely? The scientists do not agree. Some argue for expanding the label Homo longi to encompass Harbin, Dolly, Jinyushan, and perhaps more. Others reject the entire idea of naming them as a species, preferring the simple, messy truth that these were humans, just other humans, a little different, a little more robust, a little less lucky in the genetic lottery of survival. Because what the Harbin skull teaches us is not just that the past is messier than we thought. It teaches us that the past is still here, still waiting, still hidden in museum drawers, mislabeled as archaic Homo sapiens, or late Homo erectus, or morphological outlier. It is a reminder that for all our scientific tools, our lasers, our isotopes, our gene sequencers, we are still creatures of the present, trying to make sense of the echoes left by the dead. And sometimes, we get it wrong. But sometimes, every now and then, a skull emerges from a well after 90 years. A scientist scrapes a little plaque from a tooth, and suddenly, the entire story changes. Fossils may be ancient, but the stories we tell about them are entirely modern, and it turns out that paleoanthropology, the noble quest to piece together the human story, is just as human as the bones it studies. This part of the story is not about the fossils themselves, it is about us. Because the truth is, fossils do not speak, teeth do not whisper, skulls do not carry labels when they are pulled from riverbeds or scraped from cave floors. No. The narratives, the family trees, the timelines, the species names, those are all inventions. Human inventions, built not just from data, but from opinion, from argument, from culture, from bias, and yes, from ego. It is one of the dirty secrets of science that the past is not neutral. It never was. If you were to walk into the paleoanthropology archives, the papers, the journals, the field notes, you would not just find diagrams and measurements. You would find rivalries, centuries of them, battles over who gets to name a species, who gets credit for a discovery, who gets funded next year. And nowhere has this been more visible than in the story of human evolution in East Asia. Ever since the late 19th century, when a Dutch anatomist named Eugène Dubois set off to Indonesia in search of the missing link, there has been a subtle, sometimes not so subtle, competition between continents. Was humanity born in Africa, as Darwin predicted? Was Asia the true cradle of humanity, as Ernst Haeckel believed? Or was Europe the heart of the story, as many early European scientists desperately hoped? For decades, the answer depended on who you asked, and where they were funded. When the Peking man fossils were unearthed in the 1920s and 1930s near Zhoukoudian in China, some of the most extraordinary Homo erectus fossils ever found, Chinese science stepped forward onto the global stage. But when those fossils were tragically lost during the chaos of the Second World War, a shadow fell over the field. In the decades that followed, East Asian fossils like Dali, Jinyushan, Maba, and later Harbin were often seen through a Western lens. Were they simply late Homo erectus? Were they transitional forms toward modern Homo sapiens? Or were they something else entirely? A regional lineage ignored by the Africa-centered narrative of human origins. The debates were not just scientific, they were political. In China, the pressure was often to tell a story of regional continuity, a scientific narrative that aligned with cultural pride and national identity. The idea that Chinese populations descended locally from ancient Chinese Homo erectus, a view popular for much of the 20th century. In the West, the out-of-Africa model dominated, backed by fossil evidence and later genetic data showing that modern Homo sapiens emerged from Africa roughly 70,000 years ago, replacing archaic populations across the globe. But here is where the Harbin skull and the Denisovan DNA story becomes a kind of scientific grenade. Because when paleogeneticist Chow Mei-Fu pulled DNA from the dental plaque of the Harbin skull in the year 2025 and announced it was Denisovan, it was not just a scientific discovery, it was a reshuffling of power, a disruption. Suddenly, fossils that had long been treated as side notes, interesting but not central, were central. No longer just strange Chinese skulls that did not fit the Western models, no longer just regional variants in an African story. They were part of the global human puzzle, as important as Neanderthals, as important as early Homo sapiens. And that changes everything. But of course, not everyone was thrilled. If you were the lead author of the 2021 paper declaring the Harbin skull a new species, Homo longi, you might have felt a bit bruised to watch the label Denisovan steal the headlines. If you had spent 20 years arguing that East Asian fossils represented an independent evolutionary trajectory, you might not be thrilled that Western geneticists were now swooping in with their ancient proteins and DNA, redefining your fossils overnight. This is not petty. It is not even unusual. It is how science works. Behind every bone is a committee. Behind every species name is an argument. Behind every publication is a race. For credit, for tenure, for national prestige. And this is not just a story of East versus West. It is the story of paleoanthropology itself. It happened with Neanderthals. When the first Neanderthal skeleton was found in Germany in the year 1856, it was dismissed by many scientists as a pathological modern human, a rickets victim. It took decades for the field to accept that it was a distinct human lineage. It happened with Denisovans themselves. When that tiny pinky bone from Denisova Cave was sequenced in 2010, the geneticists announced a completely unknown lineage of humans. For months, the morphological anthropologists, the bone specialists, refused to believe it. How can you name a species from DNA alone? They asked. The same pattern now plays out with the Harbin skull. The morphologists say one thing, the geneticists say another. The journals become battlegrounds. The conference halls become debate arenas. And yet, through all of this, science moves forward. This messiness, the rivalry, the bias, the competition, it does not invalidate the science. It is the engine of it, the friction that creates light. Because the truth is, fossils are not puzzles waiting to be solved. They are fragments, broken, scattered clues. It takes human minds, flawed, competitive, brilliant, and biased, to weave those fragments into stories. Sometimes those stories are wrong, sometimes they are right, and sometimes they are neither, just provisional. Temporary scaffolding until the next tooth, the next jaw, the next bit of dirty plaque cracks open another 150,000 years of forgotten history. It is a humbling reminder that even as we peer deep into the past, we are still, irrevocably, creatures of the present. For a very long time, the Denisovans were not people. Not really. They were a mathematical signal, a genetic whisper in the bloodstream of modern humans, a ghost population. Nothing more than a statistical anomaly buried deep in the genomes of people from Papua New Guinea, indigenous Australians, Tibetans, and scattered faintly across Asia. No face, no body, no home. For 15 years, that is all they were. A broken pinky bone, a fragment of jaw, some scattered teeth. Enough DNA to know they were real, but not enough to imagine them. Not fully. And then, the Harbin skull came out of the well. This single cranium, wide, massive, heavy, a face broad and flat yet eerily modern, did something that no genome could. It turned a ghost into a person. It is hard to overstate how rare that is in the story of science. Usually it works the other way around. Usually we find the bones first. Then, centuries later maybe, we scrape out some DNA. But with the Denisovans, it flipped. For more than a decade, we knew the genome before we knew the face. We knew what they had given us. Snippets of DNA that helped modern Tibetans survive thin air. Fragments that shaped the immune systems of Oceania. Echoes that still whisper in the blood of millions alive today. But who were they? What were they? Until Harbin, that question had no answer. And then suddenly, there it was. A skull big enough to rival or even exceed most modern humans. A brain case over 1,400 cubic centimeters. Thick, heavy brow ridges. A flat, wide face. Delicate cheekbones tucked low, a nose broad but not projecting. A mixture of archaic strength and almost modern softness. For the first time, they were not a ghost. They were a person. And with that face came questions that are not just scientific, they are existential. Because this is not just about the Denisovans, it is about us, Homo sapiens, modern humans, the only humans left, the sole survivors of what was once a family of many. For most of the last million years, the planet was not a lonely place for humans. We were never alone, not until recently. 150,000 years ago, the time of the Harbin individual, there were at least 4 kinds of humans alive. Denisovans in East Asia, Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Homo sapiens in Africa just beginning to stir toward their global expansion, and perhaps others still lingering in pockets, Homo naledi in southern Africa, maybe the last Homo erectus somewhere in Java, maybe even ghost lineages we have yet to name. Imagine that world. You walk through the forests of what is now northern China. You smell the snow, hear the crack of ice on the river. You see the fires of another family in the distance. And for a moment you wonder, are they your kind? Or are they something else? And now, because of the Harbin skull, we can picture that. The face across the fire. The person behind the genome. This is the real power of paleoanthropology. It is not just about bones. It is not just about data. It is about breaking the illusion that history belongs to us alone. It is about remembering that our story was never ours. It was shared with them. The Denisovans are not an evolutionary footnote. They are not an exotic mystery locked away in the mountains of Siberia or the altitudes of Tibet. They are family. Look at their face. Look at the Harbin skull. Stare into those wide orbital sockets. You are looking at someone who shaped the DNA of millions alive today. Someone whose descendants may have watched the first Homo sapiens arrive from the south. Someone whose cousins may have fought, or traded, or loved, or simply watched us pass by. And then slowly, they vanished. Or maybe they did not vanish. Maybe they were absorbed, hybridized, folded into the growing, chaotic population of modern humans as Homo sapiens swept across Asia. Maybe the Denisovans did not die. Maybe they became us, or some part of us. This is where the skull matters more than the genome. DNA can tell you that someone existed. A skull can tell you that they were real, tangible, human. Not Homo sapiens, but human. And if this reminds us of anything, it is that the boundaries we draw between species, between groups, between us and them, are fragile, ephemeral. Evolution does not respect those lines. The Harbin skull forces us to look at the human family not as a tree, but as a braided stream. Branches splitting, merging, braiding back together. A web of lineages flowing together, breaking apart, leaving behind traces in bones and in blood. And this is why the story of Dragon Man matters so much. It is not just a fossil, it is a mirror. A reminder that being the last human standing does not make us the best, or the smartest, or the most worthy. It just means we were the luckiest, the most adaptable, the most ruthless, or maybe just the most accident-prone survivors of a chaotic evolutionary lottery. Look into the Harbin skull, and you are looking into a version of humanity that did not survive. A version that was just as smart, just as strong, maybe stronger, just as adaptable in their own way. And yet here we are. And they are gone. Except, of course, not entirely gone. A fragment of their DNA lives in you if you are from Papua. A little echo of them flows in the blood of Australia's First Nations. A tiny whisper lingers in the genes of the Sherpa who breathe thin air in the Himalayas. And if the Harbin skull teaches us anything, it is that the past never truly disappears. It hides. In wells, in teeth, in bones, in the cracks of riverbeds, and in the unseen corners of our own cells. Until, one day, it does not. One day a man reaches into a well in Harbin, pulls out a skull, and a ghost gets a face. There is something strange about the past. No matter how much of it we uncover, it never stays still. The deeper you dig, the bigger it gets. The further back you look, the more forward it seems to pull you. History, especially the deep, prehistoric kind, is not a line. It is not even a story with a beginning, middle, and end. It is a spiral, a loop. Every answer turns into a question. Every discovery opens a door that was supposed to be closed. This is what the Harbin skull reminds us. For 90 years it was hidden, out of sight, down a well, forgotten by science, but not by time. And not, as it turns out, by the future. Because the future was always coming for it. And when it finally surfaced, when the hands of a family, honoring the whispered secrets of an ancestor, lifted it from the dark, it didn't just rewrite one chapter of human evolution. It reminded us that the book was never finished, and it never will be. 15 years ago, the Denisovans were not even real, not in any tangible sense. They were an algorithm, a faint signature in mitochondrial DNA, a mathematical gap in the genomes of living people, a whisper, a ghost. And now, here we are, staring at their face, tracing the curve of their brow, measuring the vault of a skull that once held thoughts, memories, fears, desires. And still the story isn't done. Because if the Denisovans were a whisper until recently, what else is still whispering? What still lies hidden? In wells, in riverbeds, beneath the ocean floor, locked in teeth, stuck between proteins fossilized inside a single stubborn jaw. There are bones that no one has dug up yet, skulls resting beneath forests that haven't been cut, fingers, perhaps, still curled beneath layers of silt, waiting for hands that will not arrive for 100 years, or 1,000, or maybe never. Or maybe the next ghost is not even a fossil. Maybe it is a gene, a strange, unexplained mutation shared by distant populations. A puzzle piece lodged in the DNA of people alive right now, a clue pointing back to someone, or something, that left no trace behind but themselves in us. This is the humbling truth of paleoanthropology. The further you look into the past, the less alone you feel. Because the past is crowded, it always has been. We were never alone on this planet, not until recently. 50,000 years ago, you could have walked from Siberia to Europe to Africa to Australia, and met someone everywhere you went who was not quite you. A Denisovan in the forests of China, a Neanderthal in the hills of France, Homo floresiensis hunting on an island you can no longer walk to, Homo naledi lighting fires deep in caves in Africa. And now, there is only us. But the shadows of all of them live on, in our bones, in our genes, in our stories, and in our curiosity. Because the story does not end with Dragon Man. It doesn't end with the Denisovans, or with Neanderthals, or with the last Homo erectus. It doesn't end at all. It just keeps folding forward, as long as there are humans curious enough to ask what came before them. And that is the real lesson of this story. The fossil record is not a map of certainty, it is a collection of accidents, of things that survived just long enough to be found. And we, you and me, are the latest accident in that record, the latest moment in an unbroken chain of memory stretching back millions of years. We are the memory of the universe remembering itself. And so the question is not whether the story is over. The question is, what chapter are we in? How much do we not know? How much are we still getting wrong? Somewhere, right now, another skull sits in silence. Maybe in a cave. Maybe in a museum drawer mislabeled and misunderstood. Maybe in the pocket of someone walking along a river, not yet realizing what they've found. It is waiting. And we, strange, restless, curious apes that we are, will keep looking. Because the story never ends. It only waits to be remembered. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for wandering this timeline with me, for drifting into deep time, for slowing down and remembering. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you study, or simply helped you step out of the noise for a while, thank you for being here. If you think more people should know this story, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the sapiens in your life. And tell me, are you listening before bed, while working, or somewhere in the world I can only imagine? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.